It's just gone 4 o'clock. I'll get started. Thanks for joining us. If you're new here, we cover the news. We use lots of mainstream sources, but we try to accent those heavily with open source information developed by great accounts here on Twitter. In addition to covering the news, we try to present tools and techniques. So whether you're new to this or you've been doing open source analysis for a long time, hopefully you'll find something that will be useful to you. We could all bring our skills up together. We often will have in guests to speak to projects that they're working on. Sometimes big guests, where we'll interview them for an hour. Sometimes just updates on projects from friends of ours. The goal there is to share good work. And if something catches your interest, reach out to the people who are presenting, and we might find opportunities for collaboration and to grow the community in that way. These spaces rely heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the window where links to individual tweets are posted. And so if you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, for example, that first item is the invitation to today's space. But if you were to click through it, the thread below it includes my speaking notes and essentially the agenda. The reason I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for things. I try to provide sources for almost everything that I speak to. Hopefully it also gives you a launching point if you want to take some items away for further reading. It also allows you to look ahead, and if anything catches your interest, if you develop questions or comments, then when we get to that part of the discussion, please do request the mic and we'll bring you up, get you into the discussion. You can do that with the button in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. And since we'd like to get as many people into the conversation as possible, if you're enjoying our talk, then consider retweeting the space, and you can do that with the button in the bottom right-hand corner. So we don't have any sort of featured guests, but we do have several of our friends who may give us some updates on projects they're working on today. As usual, I'm going to start with some resources and tools that allows the room to warm up a little bit. And since a few of our friends may provide updates, we might spend a little longer at that than usual, maybe about half an hour or so. And then we'll get up to or into updates on the war in Ukraine. So if you were to start from the right-hand side of the nest, as I mentioned, the first item is the invitation to today's space with the speaking notes in the thread behind it. The second item from the right is the invitation to our next conversation. I hold these talks every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern and every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, so you could set your reminder for the next conversation now. The third item from the right is a link to friends of ours who are live streaming this conversation to YouTube. I encourage you to participate here because it's only on Twitter that you can actually speak with us, join the conversation. But if you are listening while driving or working on chores, it might be more convenient. And if you ever miss a discussion, you can always go back and listen to the recording at that YouTube account. The item in the middle of the Nest lineup there, it's titled Calendar and Events. And we set up this sort of group calendar because there are a couple of friends of ours who host spaces, Tochny and a few others. We wanted to keep those straight. And we decided that if we had it already, it would be great to add outside events. Usually it's talks from universities and think tanks. When you open up the link, it will open in your browser, and then when you click individual calendar entries, usually you'll either get a registration for upcoming events or recordings of past events. If you have any events you'd like to add to the calendar because you think people would be interested in them, please do DM them to either myself or to Jacoby. I won't break out the individual items into the nest at this point, but I'll just mention them from, again, that middle item in the nest. So under calendar and events, a couple of interesting upcoming ones are a talk that's being held by CSIS, which is on Russia as strategic threat. And so that's about Russia, Europe, and NATO and beyond. And CSIS often holds great panel discussions. The second item down there is the link to the UN schedule for this week, because the annual general meetings are being held at the UN, and there are lots of related talks as some of the heads of state will be traveling to the UN. So given that they're there together, there are a lot more events. For example, Zelensky is understood to be coming as well, and then he'll follow on to have some meetings with U.S. congressional leaders and I believe at the White House as well. So anyway, the schedule of events for the UN is there. There is also an event coming up held by the Brookings Institution on the legacy and the future of the Wagner Group, with a lineup of some very interesting speakers, many of whom are really active here on Twitter. And then finally, there is a talk that's being held by the U.S. Congressional Helsinki Corps, which Applebaum characterizes as, frankly, just genocidal. And so you might appreciate that sort of frank discussion. Is from a podcast called Cloak and Dagger. It's a fairly new OSINT podcast, or at least new to me. And they had a guest on from the Carnegie Partnership. In the nest, moving to the third item from the left, a couple more podcasts, these ones from some friends of ours. And so you'll see the first item there is Chair of Urban Warfare Studies. And he has come on and been a guest speaking with us, particularly when he developed with Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Dr. LaPlante. And this one was interesting. We'll get to it in a minute or two. So it should pop up as the first item in just a moment. And there were only a handful this week. The first of which is to note that Bellingcat is a paper that was actually highlighted by Michael Kaufman, but that was written by Bettina Renz, who is a well-known scholar on the Russian military, who it's a very interesting look at, in retrospect, what lessons can be taken, not just about the strength of the Russian military, but more to the point, Korea. And this product from Jacob is a map that has a whole bunch of relevant sort of strategic, yes, I think it was Michael Weiss was involved in conducting the interview. And it was published. I'll keep going for a moment then. And I'm going to highlight a couple of examples of good work from the last week. Okay, so FPV drones, their construction, and in particular, the fact that the video transmissions that they send out did a little bit of work on it and then wrote up a response. And so I really appreciate that some of our listeners are, paying attention and staying involved in the conversation even after our discussion here in the space. It was a week ago, Sunday, where some folks had reported, I think it was first the account here on Twitter, Gerjan, who is a great flight tracker, who had track. There was no actual plane there. And so I want this first item in the nest. I just wanted to highlight that when misinformation like that gets out, I can't remember the phrase. And apparently when contacted, refused to take the post down. And so Stefan went out of his way to make sure that a community note via Twitter was added, making the argument that it's a perfect case for a community note. And so just a reminder that our friend Colby has been chatting about this, epic thread that he's developing on Attackem's inventory and, details about the Attackem systems, and that he has now decided that it's ready for launch. And he, wanted to make sure, I suspect it was in the news cycle. So he's actually scheduled it to release it tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. So if you want to catch that first thing, if you're not following Colby, go and give him a follow. Because I suspect that Colby's built enough of a reputation here on Twitter that probably there will be defense journalists who will pick up and write articles flowing from this thread. The third item back there was an interesting item, which is, occasionally we'll talk about the idea of knowing what's usual and sort of what's reasonable. And so this was a funny flight tracking item, where on Friday, a U.S. Navy P-8, right, which is like a maritime surveillance aircraft, apparently was somehow miscoded in the flight tracking systems as a B-52, right, which is a strategic bomber. And because it was flying off the coast of Romania over the Black Sea, that caused a lot of people to scratch their heads. Why a strategic bomber? Why a strategic bomber would be in that location. And so it came out and clarified that it was definitely a miscoding. But I don't know if anybody, like Area 51, do you know why or how that would have happened? Was that sort of an intentional fudge? What do you think was up there?
Well, I think it was intentional because back on July 8th of this year, a similar occurrence happened. People were looking at flight radar and they noticed a B-52 hex code. And of course, it just populates a picture of a B-52. So that's what they see. And it was flying over the Arabian Gulf along the shores of Iran. And of course, if you got no other source to back that up, that map and that picture, you just assume that Flight Radar 24 is correct. I mean, it's a very valid source for flight tracking. But what we tend to notice, people like myself who do follow this kind of stuff, is bombers don't go anywhere without tankers, and it would take a massive tanker movement to move a B-52 from, Minot Air Force Base or Barksdale Air Force Base, where they're based in, to the Persian Gulf. And so, there's been no tanker movements, nothing. And out of all the people that track this stuff, somebody would have noticed, or myself. So I utilized Live ATC, and they have a feed out of Bahrain. And it just happened to be that this alleged B-52 departed Bahrain. Well, that's unusual in itself, because normally they go to Al Udeid and Qatar there. Or is that the UAE? Can't remember. But so I went back on the playback of the audio feed for Live ATC, and sure enough, it's a P8 call sign, and it's also, a lot of us can tell what type of aircraft it is just based on the audio. The intercom system projects certain characteristics to make them distinguishable between types. And usually the B-52 pilots will have like an oxygen mask on, so you'll hear them talking underneath their oxygen mask. So it was pretty quick to rule out. But interestingly enough, you have some big accounts like Hans Christensen at Nukestrat, who will tweet something out like this or say, "Oh, well, that's interesting," because he tends to keep track of strategic movements like this. So it almost, in a sense, ties into that IL-76, where just one screenshot of flight radar without any supporting data, and you got a lot of people in high places believing like this is really happening, when in fact it's not.
Right. And do you have any insight into why it would have been miscoded? Like, why would they want it to appear to be
And I don't have a specific example, but what I've noticed with the P8s over the years is they're doing a lot of, I don't know if clandestine mission is the right word, but they do a lot of missions where they don't like to be seen, or anybody to really tie pieces together. And it involves not only changing their hex code, which it's been noted multiple times before, but also their call signs. And I've seen flights in particular where they've changed their radio call sign multiple times en route, just to try to break up the trail of being tracked, so to speak. So it's not uncommon, and I think the next story in the list here, or after that, we're talking about an EP-3E, which is the intelligence gathering version of the P-3 Orion, using possibly a miscoded hex. The P-8's kind of taken up that role in a sense. It doesn't quite have the sensor suite that the EP-3 has, but they're doing a lot of interesting missions, and we've seen a lot of news of them flying over the undisputed islands in the South China Seas, and they're out there every day and around the world, and especially in Romania and over the Black Sea. I mean, it's almost daily, and then, of course, the Baltic Sea as well.
And so what Area 51 is referring to there is the fourth item that's back in the nest, which is where simultaneously there were two different aircraft up that were using the same hex code, which is something that should not happen. But as he just described, it may have been one plane trying to obscure its movements. I wonder, do you think it would have been intentional that they picked a currently active hex code, or was that just, a very unlikely fluke that it happened to be somebody else who was in the air?
Well, I went back through the history, and this over the past month of September and October has happened multiple times with the same hex code involving two EP3s, the one down the Persian Gulf and the one that's operating around the Black Sea. And then if you go back in history, you'll eventually figure out which is the correct aircraft, because you can see it departing its home base at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island in Washington State back in July. So, it's possible that in this particular airframe, the EP3, maybe they're just not aware, or maybe they set up similar hex codes during avionics testing or something, and somebody forgot to change it back. And the reality is when you get kind of into the weeds like this, a flight crew, unless they're specifically briefed on this stuff, which I'm sure that the P8 crews are, but maybe not necessarily the EP3 crews, that they're checking this daily to make sure that they're transmitting the hex code that's technically assigned to their aircraft. So it is kind of mystery. Yeah, was this intentional or was it not? But the fact is they're broadcasting it, and they know they got it turned on. So I have a suspicion that it's probably just someone's not paying attention to it, but.
Right. And so if you're somebody who is following flights and or new to that, and you have these situations that look odd, beyond just developing a history of understanding where different aircraft operate out of, which aircraft would normally either have escorts or tankers with them, that tip that Area 51 just gave about using live ATC to try to listen to the airfield where they would have departed from, I think is a great tip. That's one Area 51 has mentioned before in conversation. Okay.
So yeah, the best advice I can give is well, especially when it goes back to that IL-76 over Crimea, is check multiple sources. I mean, there's a handful of flight radar tracking sources: ADSB Exchange, Radar Box 24, Plane Finder, and if one's transmitting information or showing information in one spot, but not any of the other sites, then that's usually the first telltale sign. And then, if that's not the case, then you have to dig a little bit deeper. But it is interesting that, potentially just someone posting a screenshot could potentially influence, policymakers and foreign dignitaries, and, not really having accurate information.
Which is an interesting question about the balance of, as more of this raw information becomes, kind of bubbled up toward the surface via, well-known OSINT accounts, for example, on Twitter, and then adjacent accounts that deal with strategy pick them up, but maybe don't have the insight into the details of the OSINT work. Part of the question is, where does the responsibility fall, as between the account that just first says, oh, this is odd, but they haven't had time to dig into it yet, and others pick up the "this is odd" tweet and don't appreciate that there should be more digging, and then they repeat it in their authority. It's hard to see where the ball is dropped precisely, but that goes to our responsibility if you're an originator of info. But go ahead, Eric.
You should try your best. But I mean, if you look at a lot of the news organizations out there, they run with stories, and in particular, the ones that I pay attention to are commercial airliner incidents where they had to perform a go around because of they got too close in spacing, and ATC made them go around, and you'll see the headline the next day, and they're like, oh my God, dramatic incident at JFK. There was a near miss. And then you look at the details, and it's like, well, it was a rather routine go around. So Yeah, unfortunately, this stuff has been going on for a long time, even before the advent of social media.
So we might not be able to fix incentives and human nature and so on, but if we can do our small part to think about putting the info out in a responsible way, then it maybe gives a little less ammunition to feeding the sensational headlines.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so I put a bit more info up in the nest about a couple of good examples. I'll just run through a few more, then we'll get into updates on the war. There are things happening around the world all the time. We've had past guests on to speak about developments in Africa, of course, and unfortunately, we just don't often have the time to get into it unless there are significant developments. Sort of at the same time, it seems like tensions are really building between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but that's been, a low-level crisis for quite a while, and it's not clear when it's crossed to the point that we need to really focus on it. However, I do want to use as a good example people who are paying close attention. So this tweet is from the Center for Information Resilience, and they're highlighting contributions of their staff to some newspaper articles put up by the Telegraph, in particular tracking the deployment of forces by Azerbaijan toward the front that have new sets of tactical markings. And I think, almost a good half dozen markings have been detected, which is, prior to Russia following through with the invasion of Ukraine, was one of the main things that people were tracking, was trying to count pieces of equipment moved forward for staging, and in particular, the development of markings for the various groupings. So highlighting the good work by Center for Information Resilience and Kyle Glenn, but then also, if you look in the replies, I also provided a shout out to an account called Caucasus War Report, which has been sourcing a lot of these, the original imagery of the tactical markings, and Center for Information Resilience has sort of been contributing to consolidating it all. So I put this in here partly to say I'm keeping my eye on efforts, OSINT efforts in a whole bunch of different theaters. We focus here on Ukraine most of the time. So, but if people do work on those other projects, they'd like to come speak to highlight them, I'm more than open to that. So always feel free to reach out to me. The second and third items here are a little bit more detail on that outreach that our friend Cameron did that I want to highlight as good work. I don't think Cameron's able to join us today, but when he heard that the Undersecretary for procurement was doing a talk and taking questions from the public, he put together some thoughtful questions, and one of his was asked, and it was about production rates, projections for U.S. production rates of artillery shells going forward. And in fact, it, solicited brand new information that was not in the public before. And so it then came out that the U.S. is now planning to produce 100,000 155 millimeter shells per month by 2025. And it was, so Cameron is in some chats with us in the background, and it's always interesting to hear, because he says, oh, hey, this is awesome. I got a response to my question. And then we gradually saw the ripple of defense reporters picking it up, and, Reuters wrote about it. Several other sources wrote about it, and then seeing some of the big OSINT accounts here picking it up, like Rob Lee picks up the Reuters article and then covers it. And so it's interesting to see how you do have the opportunity to contribute to the discussion and soliciting information. I know that Colby has talked with us here about his efforts to reach out to defense journalists in advance who may be attending press conferences. Even if they're not soliciting public questions, you can still talk to the reporters to suggest thoughtful questions, which the reporters can appreciate, because if you're doing their work for them by coming up with good questions that then get a bunch of attention because they're thoughtful, you can influence things as well. So totally encourage the efforts of Cameron and Colby and others to reach out and influence the conversation, try and get more understanding of what's happening. And so to that end, the third item there is just Colby covering the same bit of news, giving a hat tip to Cameron, and there's a little more referencing there. And of course, I included the full video in the earlier materials. The fourth item in the nest, I just want to highlight the importance of following up on claims. And so there was a claim put out by a Ukrainian military spokesperson that had said that Crimea only had 4 days of fuel left, which was terrific news because, if Crimea ran out of fuel, it would be very hard for them to defend the peninsula. And then 4 days have passed. And so Colby did the important work of following up to reach out to the spokesperson and say, have they run out now? And I don't think he's gotten a response yet. But we'll pay attention to it. And I just want to suggest that if people are making claims like this, then you should definitely make sure to follow up because there may be breaking news that could be incredibly significant to the war effort. The last item in this block, the fifth item back by Jack Margolin. I wanted to highlight, this is about an ambush that occurred in Central African Republic, where they claimed that they attacked and killed some Wagner fighters. And they posted imagery from a journal or a logbook. And I want to appreciate the level of detail that folks like Jack are getting into. He'll look at the screenshot, read it. I think it's probably in Russian. Read it in Russian, and he's looking for code names. So he says, for example, on this one page, was the name Prakash, and then he has an understanding background on Wagner fighter code names. And he's saying, well, this makes it much more plausible that what's being shown corresponds to an ambush of actual Wagner fighters, and it implies that this individual may have been killed. So you can, getting to that level of following individual sort of public names, it takes a ton of work, and I appreciate the effort that goes into it. One more block of items, and then we'll get into the updates on the war. I'm just putting these up now. So if you bear with me, this is connected a little bit with the war at the beginning, and then it takes a turn for a moment. Right. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I had set the content in the tweet up in a way so when I clicked it, it moved me out of the thread that I was working from. So it's just going to take me a moment to get all the material up. Okay. So I was following in the last couple of days some videos that came out that were highlighting drone use in theaters beyond Ukraine that seem to be inspired by events in Ukraine. And then that sort of connected to another group of folks that we work with. So these first two items, you'll see the first is some video that shows use of FPV drones in the ongoing, I guess it's a civil war in Sudan, where FPV drones have been deployed at this choke point on a bridge where the cars can't really, run off the road to escape the drone. And there were at least 2 strikes included in the footage, which is interesting application of tactics. Similarly, the second item back from El Huaso talks about an attack that happened just the other day where one Mexican cartel group, Los Viagras, attacked the CJNG by dropping grenades from some drones. And apparently there were 2 different attacks in this way. So it seems like it's an ongoing, it's not an isolated incident. So it's interesting to see the tactics spread. We may down the road have our friend Sam Bendet in to chat about it, drone tactics beyond Ukraine a little bit more. But what this led me to was we've had some conversations with friends of ours who do coverage of cartels. We've had on All Source News as a guest before. And so we decided we should have those folks back. And so we reached out to El Huaso, whose tweet is here in the nest. And All Source News is going to join us, and as is an account from Luis Chaparro. So you'll see in the nest that some of their tweets, El Huaso's is about the drone attack, but then All Source News had a tweet just today updating his index of emojis that are used to, as code by cartels in their public postings. And the fourth item back is from Luis, who's talking about the Guzman extradition, which is fairly big geopolitical news. And so we're going to have those three on for our talk on Thursday. So we'll be going a little bit further abroad from Ukraine in our interview with them. And I've set that space up so you can have a look at my account or search for my name in the Spaces search and set your reminder for Thursday. Okay, that's it for some good examples. Let's get into updates on the war. I'm going to put the items up in the nest, so please just bear with me for a moment. Since I'm going to take a second exit, did you want to just do some housekeeping for a moment?
I would love to do some housekeeping. So up the nest that Mr. Bond keeps mentioning, that's that little space up above our heads. You'll find resources for pretty much everything we talk about goes up there. And then Jacoby is kind enough to share them down to the space tweet, which you will find down in the bottom right-hand corner. There's that little comment button. If you hit that, that'll take you to the space tweet, and that'll actually show you all of in the replies, all of the things from the nest will be shared down there. And if you want to draw more people in and have them come join our conversation, you can retweet out the space tweet. If you want to come up and chat with us, you can click the request mic button that's on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And as Mr. Bond has mentioned earlier in the space, if you go to the very front of the nest, so the very furthest right-hand side, you will find 3 in is the link to the YouTube recording if you want to go back and listen to other portions of it. If you want to find past spaces that we've done, like the one with Mike Peterson a couple of weeks ago, or Michael Kaufman, or any of the other people that we've had in here, you can go to the YouTube and find pretty much all of our recordings there.
Okay, thanks for that. Excellent. And so getting into some updates on the offensive, as usual, I'll remind you that we're not trying to break down the minute movements necessarily right up to the minute. There are great accounts here on Twitter, many of them, who are focused on mapping. And so our approach is to give you a general overview of progress so that you're up to date if you have been out of the news for a little while, and to highlight some sort of tactical strategic issues that may impact things in the next couple of weeks and months. However, if you do want specific detail on the current state of the front line, I include a tweet that has a bunch of great maps. So that's the first item that's up there now. As usual, maps from Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, Defmon, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, GeoConfirmed. And as usual, I've included the weather that our friend David is continuing to put out every day. And just a reminder that Andrew does a live stream twice a week of his map where he screen shares. Sorry, admin error there. Twice a week, Andrew does a space or a live stream on YouTube where he screen shares his map, and he walks through all the latest changes and explains them. He does that on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, and Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern, so that our friends in Europe can join him on Fridays more easily. So check those out if you want details about the front. But getting into general updates, the second item in the nest is Defmon's recent overview from this morning that just has a general update on changes in the front line and a few of his notes. So I'll leave you to explore that. Breaking it down into specific regions, I tend to move from the west through toward the east. And so the first item I thought was of interest is the third item in the nest, the tweet from the Institute for the Study of War, where yesterday they were reporting ongoing reports from Telegram saying that the Ukrainians are consolidating their positions on the islands in the Dnieper River, and that will strengthen their position because they still hold some positions on the, I believe it's the left bank, which is the eastern side of the river, some small positions, and that means that the Russians continue to be concerned about the potential for cross-river raids or a larger push down the road. So the Ukrainians sort of have still slow but steady success there. And I think that slow but steady is going to be the theme here. So the fourth item back is about progress around Robotin and Verbov. In particular, this fourth item is the tweet from WarMapper, and he notes that while there has been a lot of progress to the southeast of Robotin, that now it appears the Ukrainians are starting to press a little bit and create a little bit more room to the west of the city there, widening that gap. The fifth item there, interesting, I decided to highlight because of the interesting choice of language. So the Institute for the Study of War, in particular, was looking at the breach of the second set of defensive lines near Verbov. And in the past, we covered, George Barros and other of their analysts who have said that the line had been infiltrated, but not necessarily breached, in a way that more heavy equipment could come through it, as in some defensive lines had been captured on the opposite side, some trenches on the opposite side of the defensive line. In this update, the Institute for the Study of War is saying they now think the Ukrainian forces have likely made a significant tactical breach along that section of the defensive layer. And so I think that is them having greater confidence that the Ukrainians are now able to bring some equipment up and through those lines. I do note they use the word a tactical breach, I think maybe suggesting the line hasn't been swept away, but that it's now, permeable to more than sort of infiltrating forces. But still, I think that's good news about the Ukrainians securing their advances through those lines. The sixth item there, and these next few are all in sort of the same area. You'll likely have heard by now that the Ukrainians have now announced successes in fully liberating some cities on the flanks of Bakhmut, primarily to the south. So the sixth item is an announcement about the liberation of Klishivka, and then the seventh item is an announcement passed along from those who were fighting in Andriivka, saying that they have now cleared the village. And on Thursday night, this was the one we had highlighted, where some Ukrainian military spokespeople had come out and said they've been captured, and then the units fighting there turned around immediately and said, no, they haven't. Fighting is ongoing. Well, now these units that had said, nope, fighting is ongoing, they're the ones who are coming out and saying, yes, the territory has actually been taken. So I think that's great news, good confirmation. The eighth item back is, so if Klishivka and Andriivka are just south of Bakhmut, there's this thread from Tataragami, who is, I believe he's a Ukrainian reserve officer, writing about the significance of, in Ukrainian, thanks for the thumbs up, writing about the progress of and the significance of Ukrainian forces around, around Kurdyumivka, and the importance of the heights there and its importance as sort of a crossroads. And so I thought it was an insightful thread in that I hadn't been paying attention to the significance of this location. It's a little further south, and he suggests it may be, key to eventual progress toward Horlivka. So that's an area, I guess, to keep eyes on now that some gains have been secured in Klishivka and Andriivka. So those were sort of the individual area updates I wanted to provide. I will put up a couple of tweets now that are sort of about developments and tactics. Really just some items of interest and a couple of sort of quantitative overviews of progress. The first, which will appear in the nest in just a moment, is a video that was put out that actually shows the Ukrainians' approach when they have surrounded a territory, or they definitely feel like they have the upper hand, where they put out an announcement giving the Russians an opportunity to surrender. So it should appear in the nest in just a moment, but I thought it was fairly interesting. This particular tweet from Bandera fella doesn't link to the original source, but the logo of the unit is in the bottom, or excuse me, the logo of of the unit is in the bottom. And so if you just search the name of that unit in Telegram, you can actually find the original video there. And it's just interesting to see that the Ukrainians are trying to encourage the Russians to surrender, even when they're in a position where they could, just complete the capture by destroying the positions. The second item, back in the nest, and again, these are like indicative, interesting things we can't necessarily draw huge conclusions from. But this second item, the tweet from OSINT-TV, is a video showing 4 HIMARS launchers that are firing at the same time. And this caught my attention because a few weeks ago, there was a video that showed a battery of Ukrainian artillery. I think it was 6 guns firing at once. And I think it was CJ, who's an account here on Twitter, who's an artilleryman, at that time had noted, boy, I haven't seen a battery of this size able to operate together before. This suggests that the Ukrainians feel secure in their positions, that they can mass this kind of firepower. And then when I see these 4 HIMARS firing together, I've seen a few accounts now saying they don't think they've ever seen 4 HIMARS firing at once. And it strikes me that perhaps the same analysis is applicable in terms of the Ukrainians have enough of an upper hand in certain regions along the front where they can mass this kind of firepower. And this launch was yesterday. I haven't seen what they struck, but if they're firing this many Gimler's missiles at the same time, they probably caused, a huge amount of damage at whatever their target was. The third item, again, just indicative. This is an account, Mithridates, replying to Defmon, where there are increasing observations of actual use of T-55 tanks by the Russians. And initially, there had been talk about their use primarily in defensive positions, perhaps for indirect fire. And it increasingly seems like they're being used, in direct defenses, mobile defenses. It may just be that the Ukrainians are now advancing to positions where they can engage them. But I don't think that's a great sign I don't think it means Russia's necessarily running out of tanks, but it does mean that they're throwing more or less whatever they can at the front. And now these, sort of underpowered units by modern standards are having to be on the sharp end of the front. To that end, 2 points kind of quantifying losses. The fourth item in the nest is a tweet from Richard Veriker. And he's broken down month by month tank losses by tank model. And I shared something similar to this about a week ago that broke it down at the very detailed level, T-72A versus T-72 OBR 2002, like all the various models. In this case, Richard has consolidated them together into, T-62, T-72, T-80, T-90. And he's suggesting from his analysis that it looks like there's been a real pinch in reduction of losses of T-80s. Now, I wanted to speak to this because it's an interesting analysis, but I've seen some people say, oh, well, this means that T-80s are being wiped off the battlefield. And I wanted to highlight the dangers in interpreting graphs like these in that these are losses. It doesn't speak to, maybe it could also mean that T-80s are being deployed tactically more intelligently and surviving more. These are also the losses taken directly from Oryx's project, which, they freely admit that there is a delay and there may be biases in data collection. So there are limitations to those losses. And also you can see that part of the reason that the T-80 is diminishing in the loss count is because the T-90, the green portion of the graph, is increasing notably, which means because these are proportions, these aren't absolute numbers. It may be that T-80s are still being lost, but that T-90s, as they're running lower on various models, they're deploying more T-90s, or the T-90s that have been deployed are now closer to the front and being lost more. So I saw people taking this graph, which on its own it's an honest representation of the numbers, but they were doing analysis using it that I think was overextended, not particularly well supported. I just wanted to highlight, when you see these, take them for what they are is interesting, but inferring too much from things like this is often a risk. And just before I go to hands, the fifth item in the nest is a tweet from Nalcio, a friend of ours, also been on for an interview with us before, who works with Oryx and the war tracker losses. He does an update consolidating losses just since the beginning of the offensive. What really caught my attention at this time was I've highlighted, when using his numbers recently, how the Ukrainians had been keeping their losses almost 1-to-1 with the Russians, which is better than you would expect for an attacker. With this update, we actually see that the Russian losses in equipment are now actually surpassing the Ukrainians. So it's better than 1-to-1, which I don't know if it's an inflection point, but it's definitely moving in the right direction. Jane, go ahead.
Yeah, I have sort of a two-part question here. And it's one that does not have a definitive answer, but I'm curious to know what a couple folks think about this. The fact that there are, at this point, what are not just old tanks that are showing up on May Day, but old tanks that are showing up in battle. Evidence of the fact that Russia has done a relatively crummy job managing their hardware, and it can be anything from just, it can be a number of things. But just on the tank side of things, I mean, I know that their aircraft are really poorly managed and poorly maintained. And I'm curious to know if any of that could just be, I mean, if you're saying that, well, we know that they're losing an awful lot of hardware in the field. And if they're losing tanks and, other hardware that is land combatants, I'm just curious to know if this may be a sign of the fact, it could be them playing cagey and holding back resources. But I'm just curious to know what Colby and anybody else has to say about their overall management of tanks, and if this is indicative of anything. Like you said, an inflection point potentially as well in losses.
So while folks who are up here with us consider whether they have a response to that, I will note, we'll get to it hopefully later in the discussion, that there have been suggestions, for example, that with regard to munitions, the Russians in some ways may be holding back. I believe it was a Ukrainian official who suggested that the rate of missile attacks may actually be down slightly, with the expectations the Russians may be trying to build up a greater inventory of missiles so that if they do use them against infrastructure, particularly as the weather turns colder, they'll have a more concentrated time effect. I don't know whether they would be doing that with land vehicles. I did see an interesting observation just before the space started from the Institute for the Study of War, where they were saying they believe that the Russians may be pursuing an active defense against the Ukrainian offensive because they may be undermanned and not able to conduct a fixed position defense just because they can't man all the fixed positions, which might contribute to this idea of they cannot hold back land vehicles because they're actually short of men as well, and so they have to use what is available. But we do have some, great close observers of it with us. So Andrew, please go ahead.
Hello. I just want to comment on the T-55 thing, because I think people are misunderstanding what the T-55 represents. Because Russia didn't pull out the T-55s because they were running out of other tanks. They pulled them out because they're recently modernized and they were just convenient to field. So the issue that Russia has right now is that they have like 3,000 plus tanks sitting and various states of decay in their across the the Russian country. So pulling these tanks out is going to take. It takes about 60 days per tank to take them out, and I believe they're doing them in batches, like 2 batches of 30 or so. So like every 30 days, they're getting 30 refurbished tanks, and then in addition to that, they're also manufacturing a certain amount of new tanks. I'm not really sure how many they're manufacturing, but altogether, I believe it's averaging somewhere around like 40 tanks a month or something like that. Like, and not maybe not even that many, but the exact number isn't especially important because whether it's 40 or 50 or 60, it's still way below how many they're losing in that amount of time. So either way, they're hemorrhaging the number of tanks that they can field. So that was the issue, is that if it's going to take you 60 days to refurbish a tank, while we're waiting those 60 days, you may as well take these already refurbished T-55s and throw them into combat. And obviously they did that a long time ago, and they've been kind of sitting in the rear mostly. We've heard some from Russian tankers that they've been given T-55s when their T-90s get damaged. The T-90 has to go for repair, and while it's being repaired, they get the guys was given a T-55, so they could have a tank while the T-90 was getting fixed. So I don't know if that has been what the T-55s have been used for the entire time, like if that's like their sole purpose, or if just like a handful of them are serving that role, or whether, I'm not really sure, but I do know that was one particular tanker, one tank crew who had to suffer the T-55 for that reason. But recently, I have noticed that the T-80s have been getting slightly less common on the battlefield, or at least in losses wise. It doesn't mean that they've disappeared. Like there was a while where like every tank was a T-80 for some reason, and now there seems to be a lot more T-72s. And some more T-90s, but still the T-90s, at least from the videos that I see, are still pretty rare. Yesterday we saw like 4 of them, but I think 3 of them were the same T-90. Anyways, we've seen a lot more T-72s.
Your observations, because you're watching the front line closely, about reduced numbers of T-80s are interesting. With regard to T-55s, whether it indicates if they're running out, I know that months ago, in the fall of 2022, a year ago, I guess, that's when some of the first T-62s were being deployed, and people were saying, well, the Russians are running out. And so I guess it depends on what people mean by running out, as in they're not running toward 0% of their tank inventory left. But what it may indicate, I think, is that the demand at any given time for tanks on the front is higher than they can fill. So when Andrew refers to maybe 40 a month between new build and rebuild and so on, it seems like they're feeling under enough pressure that they decided, we should push these T-62s forward. And then they thought, we should push these T-55s forward. But, while they're not running out completely, I do suspect that these convenient models that can be pushed forward because of recent modifications, or they're actually models that readily transferable units use, if the easy inventory starts to get destroyed, and then they fall back to only having the 40 or so a month between new build and repair or renovation, whatever, that the number they have at the front will be low because they've already sort of pushed the available inventory forward. Is that fair, Andrew, do you think?
Yeah, those tanks were one-time infusions. I guess you can think of it as like taking out a loan or like borrowing money from a friend or something. There were one-time events that like they can't do more. So they were just tanks that they had handy that they could throw into combat, or at least throw them towards Ukraine. I don't think many of them actually entered combat, but they can never do that again, basically, unless they go and buy tanks from like another country or something.
Right. So they're not bankrupt yet, but they just burn through their payday loan or their fronted funds. I'll go to I have Stolas, and then we'll come back to Jane. Go ahead, Stolas.
Yeah, actually just wanted to note regarding that same topic. Russia's pulling a lot of their Eastern equipment out. I've looked over it with some other individuals, and you can tell definitive differences in satellite imagery. Yakutsk, the Kuril Islands, those particular areas where, for example, the S-300B4s were pulled out. They were replaced with BAL systems in the south end of the Omatsk peninsula. And those systems are now showing up, and they're showing up blown up on the front lines. So as far as holding back equipment, it seems the opposite is true. They're shoving anything and everything they can forward, and they're pulling it out of potentially strategically vulnerable areas within their own regions. This could even be tied back to a PMC that took over an oil field that is demanding basically money out of it. Their regional power within itself is getting weaker, and I think a lot of people are giving them more credit. Yeah, that's pretty much it. But they're definitely pulling equipment out. Even if they're replacing it with other stuff, I wouldn't expect it to be too long before they start pulling some of that stuff out too, as the equipment diminishes, because some of this stuff is just literally not replaceable, like Andrew said.
There's also an interesting dynamic that seems to be developing, and this was commentary by a mill blogger, so again, take it with a grain of salt, but there was a Russian mill blogger who was talking about how some systems are being deployed, particularly air defense systems being deployed to Moscow and politically valuable centers in Russia, and away from locations that may be more strategically significant. So it strikes me that if the Russians are seeing the same thing that we're commenting on, which is they are drawing down these one-time resources, there may start to be a bit of internal competition for them, because they see that things are running down, and so they're more valuable, which can lead to sort of internal conflict, which may be interesting to see develop in the next couple of months. Jane, go ahead.
Sure. Andrew, thank you. First of all, your analysis on this stuff is really first rate. I guess given the numbers I'm seeing from you and from a couple of other people, they are hemorrhaging hardware. I mean, on the battlefield, tanks, and we're seeing across the board, they just can't keep up with stuff. And their industrial base is already degraded. And our friend Crimson and I sort of agree on one thing. If their industrial base is in a position where they can't do what they were doing prior to the war, and they are going through new recruits at the rate they are, they can't keep up with this. It's sort of like what Russia is fighting today. And this all brings together a very interesting sort of larger picture of where the war's headed. And there's a lot of things going on here and a lot of moving parts, but this is a very, very interesting piece of it. So thank you both, and thank you, Stolas, for your input too.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I'm going to go through one more block of material. As I work through them, I tend to do developments on different locations near the front. I'd look at some sort of unusual tactical developments. This next block are sort of the broader strategic developments. After this, we'll get into updates on the Black Sea, which has been fairly active in the last couple of days. Then we'll get into some updates on hardware and so on, and we'll see. We might even have time today to get into some updates on econ and diplomacy. Okay. So somebody added something else to the front of the nest. Let me just see what that. Oh, that was me. Okay. So the first item in the front, there was an interview yesterday with Secretary Blinken, who is U.S. Secretary of State, where even though the United States has not delivered ATACMS yet, there's lots of speculation that that decision is near. And so in this interview, Blinken was asked, essentially, are you all right with Ukraine using ATACMS missiles to strike into Russia? And Blinken's response was, well, that's their decision and not ours, which sounds like a bit of a change in tone, where previously the U.S. had been very clear that Ukraine could strike Ukrainian territory, and they were very explicit that that included Crimea as Ukrainian territory. But this idea about could U.S. weapons be used to strike Russia sounds like a change in tone. Obviously, the United Kingdom and a few other allies have consistently been saying this is a war, and so the Ukrainians need to strike the assets that are attacking them, which can include sites in Russia. But if there's this distribution of opinions, it seems potentially the U.S. may have adopted a bit of a different tone. I know that some other countries like Germany are still debating changing the programming on their Taurus missiles in order to limit their use in Russia. So we'll have to see if more Ukrainian allies start to come around on this issue. Go ahead, Nukes.
I don't know if you saw or not, but one of the people from the Telegraph podcast, the British newspaper, interviewed Admiral Kirby, and he stated the exact opposite in that interview, that, U.S. weapons, we would not like them to be used inside of Russia, but there was a little bit of, however, Zelensky's commander-in-chief, so it was really ambiguous. I just thought I'd throw that out there because I just listened to it. I think it was Friday, I believe, when they did the interview.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, the Blinken statement about, well, that's the Ukrainians' decision, isn't exactly a full endorsement, which I appreciate, but it does mean that the U.S. may be more open to possibility. I do know when there were some of the cross-border raids by the Ukrainian-supported sort of Free Russia military groups, some of the equipment that they took across the border appeared to be U.S. provided equipment, and there was some brief discussion about perhaps there should be some inquiry into what equipment was used there. But for the most part, that's blown over, possibly because the raids haven't persisted. They continued for a few weeks, but there hasn't been much on that front of late. But the fact that the Americans didn't very loudly protest publicly means there might be flexibility. Okay, second item in the nest that caught my attention. It's a tweet from Dmitry, who runs War Translated. And this was a post on Telegram by Guryulov, who is a Russian general and member of parliament, who discussed problems in the Russian defense, whether that be the fact that Russia is not responding to the successful tactics of the Ukrainians in several ways. And toward the end, he started talking about how a lack of honesty in the Russian discourse is contributing to the failure. And it's, he is not the first person to say things like this, but as some people have disappeared from the field, like after the arrest of Gherkin or Strelkov, there haven't been too many prominent people who are sort of in the inner circle who have been saying these things. So it's not clear whether Guryulov is just so frustrated that he's, sort of snapped and gone to rant about these things, or whether this might be a political move to kind of seize that mantle. I don't know enough about the internals of Russian politics, but I thought it was intriguing, and some folks who listen to our talks either might have an answer or might be inspired to go and learn a little bit more about him individually to sort of see what may be motivating this approach. The third item is a follow-up We have had some brief notes on the controversy around the use of Starlink and Musk's direct involvement in availability of service. Toward the end of our discussion on Thursday, Jacoby mentioned that there was going to be a Senate investigation into this, and so I've just included an article from Bloomberg with a few more details on that. The fourth item is a link to an article from the Financial Times about some of the hard lessons that Ukraine might derive from the offensive, which, the offensive is not over. There is still scope for progress. There has been some talk from different analysts about whether, a push for Tokmak, even if the Ukrainians were successful in taking Tokmak, is that a shifting of the goalposts versus the goals of the offensive set out at the beginning of the spring? In any event, Christopher Miller for the Financial Times has been following events there, for years and years. And I thought that there were some interesting details in here about lessons the Ukrainians might want to take away from this offensive as they start to think about, what the next steps are. I think there are two more items. So the fifth is just another article that discusses the impact of weather, whether that be the fall rains or the impending cold weather. We've discussed some back and forth articles on how weather will have an effect, but that the Ukrainians seem determined to continue their offensive. We discussed most recently Budanov's interview where he said it will continue, but it will be more infantry focused. So I just thought I would include a link to this Wall Street Journal article discussing implications of bad weather, because it's part of an ongoing debate. Perhaps we'll have our friend David Helms come back in at some point to, as the rain season may develop, so we get an idea when and where things may be affected. Finally, to end this on an optimistic note, the sixth item in the nest is a tweet from Michael Kaufman. To get the context of it, you need to click through it. He is quote tweeting Defmon here. And so Defmon 2 days ago was saying essentially there's been no change on his map along the front line around Robotin for 10 days. And Defmon billed it as, it seems like the Russians have had some success, and that may be why there's been no change on the front. But it caught my attention when Kaufman, in this context, said that I think we're going to see another push. And, an opinion like, a one-off opinion like this, I might not normally highlight to you guys, but Kaufman is one of the, leading analysts of the Russian military. And if he thinks that the Ukrainians are going to, perhaps part of the reason they're not moving in the last week or so is that they may be concentrating their efforts so that they can have a concentrated push, which, I'm optimistic for. It's very interesting hearing Kaufman say that. Okay. Exit, please go ahead.
This isn't about Kaufman. I just wanted to go back to something you said actually kind of near the beginning about missile attacks when the cold weather comes on infrastructure. And I was actually talking to John earlier this week about that. And we were talking about how there's this expectation from some people that the attacks on infrastructure are going to be the same this year as they were last year. And he pointed out, and I am inclined to agree with him, that I don't think we should have that same expectation, because the available air defense assets are completely different than they were last year at this time. There's a big influx of air defense that has come into Ukraine. And so what we actually see in attacks versus how productive they are and how much defense Ukraine has to defend against them, obviously, is probably going to be a very different story than what we actually saw last year. And so kind of readjusting our expectations, or even understanding that we don't really know what the expectation should be, is a thought I think some of us should kind of consider going forward. And I'll just take a quick note to do some housekeeping quick. If you are new here, you might not know that up in the nest we share resources for everything. That's just above our heads. When we're done with those resources, I take them out of the nest and they get shared down to the space tweet. You can find that in the bottom right-hand corner and share that out if you want other people to come in here. And then if you want to come up and speak with us, I know we're moving on to the Black Sea. Some of you might want to join us. There's the request mic button in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And finally, if you do want to see any of our recent episodes or other episodes that we've done, you can go to the YouTube stream. That is the third from the right up in the nest, and it will always be the third from the right up in the nest. Just click that whenever you want to see any of the old episodes, and you'll find them all there. Are you back, Mr. Bond? There you go.
I'm all set. Thank you very much. So moving on to the Black Sea, the first items I thought we'd do are a little bit more follow-up after the missile attacks on the dry docks at Sevastopol. And so you'll see that the first item there is a link to a Radio Free Europe article discussing the limitations that the destruction or damage of the dry docks will have on Russian operations. This one's interesting because a naval account here on Twitter, The Lookout, I like following individual storylines. And so The Lookout recently decided to start going by his personal name. You know, he has dropped anonymity. So he is Thord R.A. Iverson. And I guess in connection with that idea of being more open, The Lookout contributed for the first time to a public article. So I think it's pretty cool seeing a couple of OSINT accounts saying, hey, I'm comfortable enough in doing this work and I've built enough of a reputation that the media would like to speak with me. And so now my thoughts are going out into the broader world. So do check out that Radio Free Europe article on the limitations of dry dock availability. The second item in the nest is a thread, once again, from Tatargami, where the one thing that he's particularly pointing out is the wreckage in the dry docks. The Russians appear to have pulled a large green tarp over a portion of the wreckage, which leads to some questions about what it may be that they're trying to conceal. I think some people have suggested maybe the propellers on the submarine. There are a couple of other alternatives. But so as not to steal too much thunder, Exit, go ahead.
Well, so regarding the Radio Free Europe article, one of the things that they note in there is that the delays in cleaning out the dry docks, or probably that the dry docks are not harmed in any way, and they probably are still operational, at least mostly operational, maybe some smaller damage that needs to be fixed. But even just cleaning out the dry docks, either floating those ships out to somewhere else where they can get fixed because they may not have the ability to do them in Sevastopol anymore, or hauling the wreckage away and doing something with that will take a long enough time that it's going to create maintenance delays for the other ships and other subs that are in Sevastopol and the Black Sea in general. And those dry docks are capable of maintenance that some of the other dry dock options in the Black Sea are not capable of. And so just generally, maintenance for the Black Sea fleet is going to become a massive issue going forward. And that alone might actually start affecting how often they can use those assets in the Black Sea for anything, really.
Which is essentially, repeating some analysis we discussed recently from the account Granger, who also does great naval analysis. And I'll repeat the point, which is that if I were some of those other dry docks in Sevastopol, there's one land-based dry dock and then 6 or 7 floating dry docks, I would be pretty nervous right now. As you know, if they can diminish the capacity there further, that'll just complicate their lives that much more. The third and fourth items in the nest are additional details working toward evaluating the damage that was sustained. The first is from H.I. Sutton, who had highlighted the damage. It looked like the striking point of the missile on the Kilo submarine itself. And, he particularly focused on the downward trajectory and that, the damage is likely significant. And it may be that the downward penetration would have penetrated the main pressure hull, which would be, essentially, if not irreparable, then extremely difficult to repair. Area 51, go ahead.
Hey, I noticed HI is in the audience and just wanted to ask if he was willing to come up and speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we're always happy to have people join us, but also if people just want to hang out and listen, we totally understand that too. So no pressure either way. I do like highlighting good work wherever it comes from. The fourth item in the nest is, again, battle damage assessment. This one on the Minsk, which is the landing ship. I just like this because it's a different style. So you'll see the tweet from Mojavensis. Somebody had requested, it was a video that panned the length of the ship. And somebody had said, hey, can you stitch this together as a panorama so that you can see it as a whole? And of course, there's distortion in the perspective once you stitch it together. But it was still a pretty cool effect. I know that I have done similar panorama stitching for geolocation purposes, but I've never seen it applied sort of in a battle damage assessment scenario. So I thought it was a cool application. So I see that Mr. Sutton's been able to join us. Did you want to add anything into our coverage of your assessment of the damage to that sub? We'll take a moment. Can
you hear me now?
Yep, it comes through loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, sure. Just add the image I was using was, I think, released by the British MOD, and it's the same imagery that had been released a bit earlier as well. And they had indicated where the impact happened, so it wasn't me. But then applying that to plans of the submarine, we can see that it would have impacted in the area of the forward sort of dome of the pressure hull. And Storm Shadow, as you probably know, is a downward penetrating warhead, the Broach warhead. So the main damage would have been inflicted beneath the point of impact. It would have hit the torpedo tubes at the minimum, and probably, it's difficult, obviously, without being there, and none of us have, I don't think anyone in the world has really seen a Storm Shadow impact on a submarine before. But yes, knowing what we know about submarines and the plans and the warhead type, then expect that submarine to be very seriously damaged. Submarines are quite fragile. Obviously, they're capable of diving at great depths, but they have to be designed and maintained in good shape to do that. And if you give them, any holes in the pressure hull, or move pipes around, and the torpedo tubes are one of those weak points where there's joins, then it's very serious damage. In terms of the green tarpaulin, as someone mentioned, I've not rushed to conclusions there. I don't think it's got anything to do with the screw, the propeller at the back. Russia doesn't ordinarily do that. But it surely is to do with the damage to the submarine. One, and this is speculation, but one scenario might be that they're going to cut the back off the submarine, as maybe that can be salvaged and the front can't. That's based a little bit on what's been done with other submarines that have been damaged in other ways, such as the fire on a French nuclear submarine a couple of years ago. But that's just speculation as to why you might cover it. I would caution against implying too much from that at the moment. One takeaway, though, I think, is that submarine's going to be there for some time. I don't think they would cover it like that. They were just going to drag it out and clear the space.
That's a great insight about it likely remaining in place. Exit, go ahead.
So just generally, if you were trying to repair that submarine, I don't presume that you can just kind of weld the hull back together and everything will be fine. I assume that the pressures that sub is going to go under when it goes down to depth make a repair like that a much more significant issue than just weld everything back together and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with you. They might patch it for surface transit to a shipyard where it can be repaired, but I'd question whether that shipyard can repair things even if it wanted to, of that extent. They obviously can maintain submarines, but it's we're talking about seriously damaged submarine, as has been the assessment of the UK MOD in their statements as well. So yeah, it is very seriously damaged, and I know people have been quick to say it's damaged, it's not lost, or and so on. But that's likely a loss. I don't think that's going to be recovered. That submarine's my guess. If it is, it's going to be incredibly expensive and very long term.
Well, thank you for that. I'm seeing a few hands go up, so I suspect they may be questions for Mr. Sutton. So we'll run through a few of those, and then hopefully we won't overwhelm him too much. But it was Stephen first, and then Nukes. Go ahead, Steve.
So hi. I was just wondering, the missile, it impacted the front of the submarine, and I believe it was either earlier this year or last year that we saw a US Seawolf class submarine impact something in the South China Sea. So I was just wondering, and that Seawolf submarine, I believe, managed to make it back to port. So I was just wondering, how comparable would the damage of those two incidents be, and is there any chance whatsoever that the submarine is seaworthy enough to be transferred to, say, Novorossiysk or some other facility where it can be worked on, or would that even be worth kind of undertaking that operation to free up dockyard space in Crimea? Thanks.
Yeah, firstly on how comparable the incidents are, they're quite different, I'd say, both because of the way the impact happened, but also the makeup of the two submarines is very different. The Seawolf class submarine hit, basically drove into a seamount, like a mountain under sea. And of interest there, at the front of the submarine, they've essentially got a large sonar array, which the dome took the impact, and the dome was lost, but it acted a bit like a crumple zone on your car, not by design, but by luck. And the torpedo tubes and similar sorts of openings are largely somewhat further back. There are, if you look at, or if you have knowledge of Seawolf class submarines, you can see that it's still pretty close. That was pretty bad for the submarine. This is going to be quite different. This is an explosion, something that's trying to penetrate through essentially armor, in this, in the sense. Submarines, they have to be in really good shape to be used. And the Seawolf submarine is, as far as I'm aware, I haven't been following its repairs, but I imagine it's still being repaired, right? It's with the patching, I think they'd only need to patch it for a service tow. They wouldn't bother, Yeah, until it's been inspected, I don't think that even if it was only slightly damaged, they wouldn't put it to sea until it's been thoroughly inspected. And yeah, I think it's quite different in terms of where they could take it. I don't think there isn't anywhere in the Black Sea that would be any better, other than it being out of the way. If they just wanted to clear the dry dock, the shipyards that can do work on it are nowadays going to be in St. Petersburg. Maybe they could farm it out to one of the other shipyards, but yeah, it's a long journey.
We'll go to Nukes and then Area 51. Go ahead, Nukes.
Well, he answered my question right at the end, so we'll go on Area 51.
Perfect.
Well, first off, I wanted to say, not knowing much about the maritime craft, submarine ships, your cutaway diagrams that you produce are spectacular, and I learn something new every day. That these, I call them forward canards, coming from an aeronautical term, but they were, you reference them as hydroplanes that are retractable for these improved kilo class subs. Is there any way to distinguish which particular named kilo sub this is, looking at the evidence that you've seen, or is that just too difficult? Because my understanding is basically the dimensions and the length of these improved kilo classes are all pretty much identical.
Yeah, there's a certain number of known submarines in the Black Sea, and they can't get more submarines there. Certainly without being noticed. The kilos, the improved. So there's one original kilo and four improved kilos. They're very hard to tell the difference on satellite imagery. In very good satellite imagery, it's possible. There are, in fact, I know people we've had that exact discussion and tips on how to do it. But in typical satellite imagery, it's nigh on impossible. But in this particular case, it's made it easier because the single non-improved kilo is a rosa, which is unique in that it has a pump jet, and that changes its external form. So you can see, generally speaking, just by eye, you can say, yeah, that's a rosa, if you know what you're looking for. And it's the propeller at the back. The screw is replaced by a pump jet, like it looks like a bit like a jet engine at the back. In terms of identifying which of the four improved kilos by satellite imagery, no, but by other sources, yes. And in fact, this case is just no real doubt. It was consistently reported in Russian media as to which one it was. Rostov-on-Don, if I'm saying it right. And I've got no reason to doubt that at all, I'd say. So we know exactly which submarines. From Ukraine's perspective, it doesn't really matter which it is. There's four that can launch caliber, and they've also blocked up a dry dock, as the Outlook said. Oh, sorry, Lookout said.
So taking one moment before going to Jane, just so that I can switch over material in the nest as we're chatting. I want to highlight the fifth and sixth items in the nest. So the fifth is some imagery that came out just before the space started from Brady Afric. He's generated a GIF showing the change in the imagery of the dry dock. And the thing that I observed, there may be other things to take away, but that I observed was the movement of the cranes, including that most recently they appear to have been moved, adjacent to the ships, and they look like they've actually been, had their arm swung out over, suggesting that they may be workable. Because that was one item that we were looking at in terms of damage to the docks, suspecting they may be some of the most critical equipment, and it looks like they're in use. The sixth item back there was a little additional insight. Previously, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force had come out and said it was their pilots who were involved in the combat. They now, so that item's now disappeared, but I'll put it back up in a moment. The Ukrainian Air Force spokesman had come out and said, in fact, there were Storm Shadow missiles under one wing and French Scalp missiles under the other, and saying that both were used. I don't know whether that would be a typical loadout, whether there would be strategic value or tactical value in having them both available, or whether knowing this was a particularly significant strike, perhaps for political reasons they wanted one of each. But I'm not sure about that. I do see that Colby's hand has come up in response, I think, to my comment. So I'm going to go to Colby. I'll switch material over, and then we'll go to Jane. So go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. For all practical purposes, they are the exact same missile. There's no advantage to using one or the other. They have the same capabilities. So I think it would really just come down to sort of messaging, sort of propaganda of sorts, you could say, just demonstrating, we're using both British and French missiles to do these strikes. And, we have implied, permission to use those munitions on Crimea, because I know some people were suggesting that Ukraine had been told by donor countries not to use their weapons in certain circumstances. And it would seem that the British and French are not placing those restrictions on those missiles being used in Crimea. So I would say that's the reason. There isn't any tactical reason why you would want to use one or the other or both.
Obviously a difficult thing for us to confirm, but even the fact that they're highlighting it suggests that they think there could be political benefits to saying we're making good use of munitions from both countries. Jane, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for coming up and your analysis of these attacks have been truly insightful. Thank you for your work. One question: the attack on the Kilo. My understanding of just not only what got damaged, but the way the missile hit it and pretty much everything, the damage of the pressure hull, whole 9 yards, makes this submarine really close to something that an awful lot of countries would scrap. And it's going to be incredibly expensive to repair this, given the spaces that were hit. That's correct. Am I right on that? And I'm assuming they're going to have to get this back to Admiralty in St. Petersburg to get it repaired in any way, if it's repairable. Would those be good guesses in your mind?
I guess that's for me. Yes, I would agree with you entirely on that. And I mean, I would treat it as a loss. In fact, I even put a YouTube video saying it's a loss, and advise you not to read the comments. But it's as you say, other countries would consider it a loss. It'd have to be completely rebuilt. Exactly how much damage, of course, we can't see ourselves. But yeah, that would be a default view.
By the way, I saw that video of yours on that attack has, I think it's approaching 400,000 views. So clearly there's a lot of interest in your analysis, which is great news. So we've been joined by Ancient Submariner. So we'll go to him probably for the last question on this front, and then we'll move on to discuss the recent USV attacks. So go ahead, Submariner.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. Just to kind of add on to what was just mentioned there, the positioning of any impact is going to have a huge effect on any long-term repair to that type to any type of submarine, really. I mean, don't get me wrong. They're built very, very strong. They can, and I can attest to the fact they can take a lot of damage, but there's not a lot of damage you want. Let's just say the ship next door in the dock next door was patchable. You could put it in, it'll float and you can, for all intents and purposes, have a platform that can perform some kind of job relatively quickly, although you wouldn't want to be going too quickly, especially not the Russians in the kind of war they're fighting at the moment. But submarines are a whole different ballgame, because, as was alluded to, the pressure hull takes some damage. Now, how much of that pressure hull has been chipped away by the impact of the strike? How many of the valves were shocked to such a point where any of the pressure hull penetrations and valves need to be completely replaced or assessed for repair or to be allowed to continue to be used? And let's be optimistic, and let's say that's 2 months. They get all that done, and that's really optimistic. Then the submarine will be a different weight. It will have a different buoyancy characteristic. It will probably have resonant frequency changes based on the damage that was caused and any subsequent damage to other systems that have been put through a massive shock on their rafts and mountings. I don't think the Russians, even before this war, were equipped to make massive changes like that, to take a submarine like that and scoop everything out and sort it out properly. And it would take a long time anyway. That's the kind of thing that you'd have long time planning for, and you would be conducting in a very organized and structured manner, or as organized and structured as they can be. And the fact is, they've now got a dry dock with a hulk in it, and if they were to push it out, it's maybe not going to be the platform that it was before. Even if they try, who knows what happened to the tubes when it was struck, and the firing mechanisms and everything like that. There's every chance that they put that out, consider it a loss to the capability, and put it out in just about a seaworthy state to just be a listening platform.
Use as a listening platform would be an interesting application. I would also be interested, Mr. Sutton referred to potentially cutting the back end off the submarine. If they did that, would they just be holding that for speculative future use, or because that's a particularly valuable portion of the submarine? How easy is it to cut it in half like that and use a portion in the future?
Well, not too long ago, the French Navy had an unfortunate disaster in dock, and they had a boat have a fire at the front, and they happened to have a spare hull lying around, and the most economical way of making the repair and the most efficient way, rather than building a whole boat, was to cut them both in half and put them together. And it's actually a longer boat now, so it's different. The buoyancy characteristics are different. The acoustic signature is different. They, in that case, were able to just cut and shut and turn it into exactly the same capability of platform, but it's a unique platform now. It has, like I said, acoustic characteristics that will only be attainable by that submarine. So anyone listening and discovering it will know exactly what it is straight away, which, it's not the best thing, because then that means that everyone knows what to look out for if they were to be looking for it. And that would be the same scenario with this Kilo. If they were to do that, they might have a slightly longer or slightly shorter boat. I would guess they would want to go slightly longer as well, if that was what they would do, because it would only it would be the best way of doing it. And then on top of that, they'll need to recalculate everything. They might not be able to have a full weapon load, because the buoyancy and the physical weight of the boat would be different, but also the diving characteristics, the speed characteristics. To get the same speed out of the boat, you'd have to turn the shaft a few more times. That would give it not only a different acoustic characteristic, but the way the engines work, the wear and tear on them would be different. The way the boat moves, it might have biases in the way it turns, and when it dives from the surface down to its periscope depth, when it's rocking the bubble, it may take a lot longer, a lot shorter than normal. When they go deep, how deep can they go? Can they go slightly less deep because of the change in the characteristics of the boat? Again, the metal used might be heavier, so they might not be able to go down as quickly as possible. It opens up all kinds of possibilities about detection and the vulnerabilities of that one unit.
Which certainly creates lots of opportunities for analysis and content development for people who follow these decisions closely. So I'm sure that Mr. Sutton will be paying close attention. I suggest everybody check out his account, consider following him, and we'll see these analyses come up as the Russians decide how to proceed. I thought I would move on now to discussion of the most recent USV attacks. So you'll see those items up in the nest. The first of which is just video confirmation released by the Ukrainians that they did attempt to attack the Vasily Baikov. Again, we don't have confirmation of damage to that ship. But then with the second item in the nest, the Russians then subsequently disclosed that their other ship, the Samum, had been attacked, and they claimed that they had defeated those attacks, which is their normal response. But now we have a couple of clues that there may have been damage sustained by the Samum. So if you were to look at the, I believe it's the third and the fourth items back, there was imagery of the Samum being towed into port at Sevastopol. So it returned very shortly after it departed, and it returned within about a day, suggesting that it didn't continue its cruise, so it did return for some reason. The photographs were of it then being towed into port. Mr. Sutton has pointed out that towing of these ships in the port is very common. You can't infer very much from that alone. He then noted in this third tweet that it did look like it was possible that it was low in the stern, suggesting that it may have taken some damage. And further to that, the fourth item in the nest is from our friend MT Anderson, who regularly is getting satellite imagery of the various ports to look at what ships are in port. And he noted that the Samum was set alongside at a point that's usually intended for a repair bay, suggesting, again, that it may have sustained some damage. It's just not clear how significant that damage may be. I don't know if anybody has heard any further updates or seen anything since the material I have available, but as far as I know, that's the latest, is that it does appear to have been potentially riding a little bit low in the water. It's at the repair bay. It was towed, but towing alone is not definitive. So I understand that's sort of the state of things. Okay, but I'm always happy to have updates or comments. The next two items in the nest, the fifth and the sixth. So the fifth, again, is a tweet from Mr. Sutton, who talks about how the Ukrainians have described the USV used in this case as that the Russians have described the USV used in this case as an unmanned semi-submersible, which apparently seems to be new wording. It's not clear, at least to me, whether that's just a change in terminology or whether it may be implying that a different variant of USV is being used. The Ukrainians do have an ever-expanding set of USVs that, again, Mr. Sutton has been tracking. If I can find it fairly readily, I know that he's put up a graphic showing the range of the 5 or 6 different types that we've seen so far. However, the sixth item, last in this block, is a Ukrainian report where they're referring to the USV used in this strike on the Samum as the sea tadpole. And interestingly, I've seen two different names applied to it. I have seen the tadpole name, but I've also seen other sources refer to it as the sea baby. My understanding was that the sea baby was actually the larger USV variant that was used in the most recent attack on the the most recent successful strike on the Kerch Bridge. So I'm just not clear what they're referring to, but hopefully from our discussion here, we'll clarify that a little bit. Go ahead, Exit.
So that actually was my question is, do we know whether the sea tadpole and the sea baby are the same device? And do we know any other specifications about, I guess, depth for either of them? Because one of the concerns that we've talked about here a number of times is that with the traditional USVs that we've watched them use in the SIG attack and others, traditionally they're operating on very calm seas, no more than like 1 meter waves. And it seems like they're very conscious of those USVs operating in very specific conditions, whereas these two may have some other properties that allow them to operate outside that, which is useful coming up because we're coming into the stormier season for the Black Sea in general, where your wave heights are going to be much higher. And in order to continue attacks like this on the Black Sea Fleet, you're going to need to be able to operate in much stormier seas. So I haven't seen any particular documentation about that or any other information out there, but I was wondering if anybody else had, and if there was a distinction between the tadpole and the baby. And if anybody has comments, I would love to hear them.
Well, I have the same questions as you do. So, I mean, short of any revelations, I suppose we'll have to keep that as one item that we are keeping our eye on. Always happy to be updated on that front. To that end, hopefully in just a moment, I had sent it to be uploaded to the Nest, but I'm not sure this is the most up-to-date version of it, but there was a version on the evolution of Ukrainian USV systems that Mr. Sutton put together back in July, so there might be a more modern version. But you'll see that as the first item in the Nest. And so we'll have to hold out in order to see whether there will be a new edition of a sea tadpole to this list in the coming days and weeks. Okay, so we'll move on to a discussion of some of the most recent economic implications of events in the Black Sea. If you have a look at the second item in the Nest, you'll see there was big news in the last few days that it looks like ships may now be working their way into the port of Odessa, which is, incredibly significant. And so this is on a plan developed by the Ukrainians. We've heard lots of updates from Exit, in particular, who's been following these issues, about how the Ukrainians are working at this, but ultimately it was down to the faith of the ship owners as to, how safe would they be? Could they obtain insurance? I don't know that all of those, if we have answers to how those concerns have been completely resolved, but it'll be great to follow. So Exit, feel free to work through the 2 or 3 items in the Nest on this, because you're the one who's following it.
So first off, the Puma came out. It was stuck in Odessa for 568 days, which is a really stinking long time. It was carrying both wheat and steel, and I think it's quite notable that the ships that were stuck in Odessa for since the full-scale invasion, most of them carried out something other than agricultural product. And that's notable because the Black Sea Grain Initiative was only ever supposed to be grain, and Russia refused to include any other cargoes into the initiative. So that is just notable on its own. And then we finally saw the first two ships sail into Odessa. They sailed in yesterday, yesterday, which was extremely exciting for a lot of us who follow this. And they came along, they sailed in perfectly well, went to the Odessa area, Anchorage, either were inspected or picked up a pilot. That part isn't entirely clear, but they turned around and then went into Chernomorsk, the port there, and came alongside there, and they are reportedly being loaded with wheat there. It's notable that those two ships are quite small. So, for instance, the Aero Yacht is 3,500 metric tons. It's essentially not much more than like a tugboat. It isn't carrying very much wheat. If you go back to the very first days of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, this is almost exactly what we saw there, that we expect to see very small ships that are quite old. Those ships are also quite old. I think the Aero Yacht was built in 97 and the Resilient Africa is built in 2001. So as ships go, they're getting up there for sure. And sorry, the Resilient Africa is the smaller of the two. I had them mixed up in my brain. My apologies. But they're older ships. They are smaller ships. So the risk profile for those ships is much lower than we would see, for instance, with a Panamax ship coming in, which could carry up to, we saw shipments going out of the Yuzhny port during the Black Sea Grain Initiative of 75,000 metric tons and over. And so when we're talking about 75,000 tons versus 3,200 tons, there's obviously a vast disparity, and the smaller ships are essentially just willing to take on more risk there because their insurance isn't going to cost as much. It's more economically viable and less risk than what we would see with the bigger ships. They are, however, extremely important because if you don't have somebody take that risk first, nobody else is going to follow along. And so watching them go in and hopefully load wheat and be able to transport back out, because they're smaller ships, they may also be able to load faster, which might keep them in port for less time and be less of an overall risk to Russian aerial attacks. That part is unclear, but it's definitely a consideration that some shippers may be taking in. Now that we have two in, there's at least one other ship that is reportedly booked, and I know there are others that people are talking to, and they look quite promising. There hasn't been a lot of information on the actual insurance that's being provided, so I don't have an update on that specifically, but just generally, it's very exciting to see this happening and to see it being just a productive, very economical way to export Ukrainian grain. And so far, we haven't seen Russia doing anything to stop these ships, or at least not effectively doing anything to stop these ships so far.
Well, that's great news. As Exit says, there may be further developments in the offing. We just don't have, enough confirmation of or source on to report on at this point. But we'll, definitely Exit will obviously be following it, and we will keep an eye on it here in these spaces as well. To set the broader context for that, rather than break the items out, I've put the next little set up as a whole block in the front of the nest. So the individual links are within that one tweet. But there has been development with regard to the ability to export Ukrainian grain via certain EU countries. Excuse me. So if you were to look through that tweet, you'll see that There's the Reuters article. Zelensky was noting that the European Union has dropped at the union level the import bans that had been in place for 5 countries. However, you can see from the Kiev Independent article that Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia have decided to extend their own bans or restrictions at the national level. And that via the third item, in fact, Poland has added additional restrictions via its national level that go beyond even what had been imposed at the EU. Which is unfortunate. It's an ongoing negotiation, I'm sure. Poland has provided lots of support to Ukraine, so I'm sure it's part of a broader dialogue. However, on a more positive note, the next 3 items in that same tweet, you'll see where it says that Romania is open, is a discussion about how Romania is, it had been both, I believe it was Romania and Bulgaria, had been among those EU countries that had restrictions on Ukrainian grain. Bulgaria previously announced it would not continue them. Romania has now come out and said it will not continue them either. However, it will take measures to prevent excessive supply. And so we'll just see what details come out in their plan, which is due out tomorrow. Are just also some updates from the U.S. on investments that they're making in Danube ports. And we've heard lots of reports about various countries, Croatia and so on, upgrading their port infrastructure to better facilitate, increased volume of Ukrainian grain flow. So there are other efforts afoot as well. Finally, the last item in that block, you'll see under the phrase transshipment at Constanta. And this is a friend of ours who's based in Romania, who's passed along an article from local media talking about how they'll permit ship-to-ship transfers, which I think may just ease the logistical burden of shipment out of those ports. But I know that Exit has more details. So Exit, go ahead.
Just on the Poland thing, it's not overly clear that move by Poland is anything other than related to their elections. And I would wait until the end of October when that's all over and done with and see what they move forward with after that, because they're trying to get reelected, and that's the most important thing for them right now. I keep saying it, but internal politics of each of these EU countries has a big influence on how they react to Ukrainian things. Regarding the transshipment, so your ports are only so big. You can only fit so many ships inside them. Generally, you wouldn't want transshipment activities going on in your anchorage, depending on what the cargo is, for lots of reasons. But if you can do that safely, and if there is just a lack of port space, considering how to do transshipment and how to do it effectively and quickly, and maybe putting some other resources towards it. If you don't know what transshipment is, it's just when you're taking cargo from one ship, and putting it onto a different ship. Specifically, if in this case, if you're taking some of the smaller barges that can travel the rivers and taking them alongside some of the larger ships that can actually do cost-effective long-term delivery to further away countries. And so you would bring those smaller ships alongside the bigger ships. You would transfer the cargo on. You would probably need a couple of the smaller ships to fill up the bigger ship. If you can do that without ever actually accessing the port and taking up dock area and having to unload it, maybe store it for a certain amount of time, which there's a lack of storage in those port areas as well. You're just fixing a whole bunch of different problems there. And if you can do that effectively, it means that we're probably going to be able to move a lot more actual cargo out of that general area than we could without doing that.
Right. So the export via EU countries is a bit of a good news, bad news story. Obviously, some restrictions still in place. In Poland, they're bound up politically, but progress on other fronts. a couple more items in connection with the Black Sea. This is more of a roundup. So unfortunately, Russian drone attacks on port infrastructure continue. I know there were reports of air alerts and explosions in the Odessa region last night that may have been against infrastructure. Frequently, every few days, it seems like Russia has continued to attack the Danube ports of Reni and Izmail. You'll see the first item in the nest, though, that Ukraine is responding, including striking locations, naval relevant locations in Crimea. So there's the Reuters article on it, and then the second item in the nest on the same front is the Lookout talking about military installation near Cape Violent that apparently was struck by drones. In related economic news, in the back and forth, the third item in the nest is coverage about the fact that Turkey has now announced that they are suspending a project that was planned in order to develop a significant natural gas hub in Turkey to export Russian gas. And at least this tweet is suggesting that may be because of increased tension with Russia's refusal to resume the grain deal. But as we've discussed many times before, the relationship between Turkey and Russia is complicated. There are lots of economic angles, including development of a nuclear power plant and others. This is part of a complicated sort of power struggle back and forth. Exit, go ahead.
Let's be real. The relationship between Turkey and everybody is complicated, and they like it that way. This is a lot more of what I expected to see coming out of the meeting in Sochi than we heard publicly. It's apparent that this messaging was going around kind of privately, but we hadn't heard Erdogan come out and kind of push back on Putin at all publicly, which is something that he has done after almost every other meeting regarding the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And frankly, I was a little bit surprised that it took as long as it did for this kind of messaging to come out. I had mentioned that to a couple of people, that I kind of expected him to go home and say a few different things, and he just wasn't. He was quite quiet for a little bit. So in a lot of ways, I find this message quite encouraging in that he's pushing back on Putin generally, and not taking all the blame and not completely supporting Russia's actions generally. And I just think that it's possible that he's not the Russia shill that a lot of people have wanted to paint him as since the Sochi meetings. Not that he is intentionally one way or the other than that he's looking for the best deal for Turkey. And if Putin's not willing to play ball, it's quite possible that he's going to go play ball somewhere else. And if he can put some pressure on him to try and draw back into the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which ultimately benefits the Turkish economy more than just that one little deal with Russia to supply wheat to African countries, which still, to my knowledge, has not actually shipped any wheat anywhere. Generally, pushing them back into a Black Sea Grain Initiative or some kind of other broader initiative is where Erdogan will want to have Putin. And it's nice to see that he's kind of taking a step towards that, at least. I'm still not an Erdogan supporter per se, but I'm happy to see he's at least playing the game a little bit more than he was.
Thank you for that. Continuing along with the items in the nest, again, kind of a roundup of news in the Black Sea. The first item is a tweet from, I know, a close observer of naval matters, Gunny, here on Twitter, who is suggesting that he thinks that the Ukrainian presence on the oil rigs really presents Russia with a dilemma, in that he thinks that there is a gradual erosion of Russian awareness, right, via these attacks on the radar systems and electronic monitoring systems, so that Russia really is coming to a point where it will have to make a decision about whether to proactively assert itself and move, forward, whether that be additional patrolling or, capture of some positions or retreat, and that both of these have, negative implications. Gunny's belief is that if the Russians try to push forward, that puts their assets at greater risk and that they'll take losses as a result. And I thought this was interesting because on Thursday, we spoke about a thread from Mike Peterson where he was criticizing the Russian Black Sea Fleet commander for his lack of initiative and failures there. And I think that this sort of highlight of a dilemma that they're in from Gunny is sort of an extension of, yes, they've made mistakes, and now they're in a very difficult position where they're prone to make further mistakes. Nukes, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to add to that because we had just done some recent analysis today of the S-400 launch site that got hit there by, is it Vaporizhzhia? I can never say the word. Anyway, Marin Crimea that we all saw the other day. It appears that the entire group of tells, the entire battery is gone. I pulled out the morning of the 14th. Where they went, I don't know. Whether they'll be back to one of the 3 prepared sites in the area, I don't know. But I know this was referenced as part of the greater, the strikes on the air defense systems in the western part of Crimea were kind of cited as part of this as well. And, something has caused them to move multiple tells, command post radars, everything. So very interesting.
It certainly is. And I see that Exit has added your thread on that development to the nest. So if you guys are interested, check out Nuke's write-up. And I mean, perhaps it's not clear yet, but perhaps that might be indicative of a gradual process of shifting back. Maybe they've just moved that one particular system in an attempt, because if the location's known, they need to protect it. But we'll just have to see. I know that Nukes and others are watching carefully, their eye in the sky, and if it's deployed somewhere else, I suspect that there will be telltale signs soon enough. The third item in the nest is just, if you were interested, from that footage of the capture of the Boyko Towers, the drilling rigs that came out a week ago, there was an interview with some of the personnel involved there where they describe some of the details. So you might like to dig into that a little bit more. The fourth item, we, in the last 2 sessions, have been discussing the responses of Romania to the downing of drones on their territory from the attacks intended on the Danube ports. But they're going, the drones are going long and landing in NATO territory. And we talked about their defensive steps they were taking. This tweet, the fourth back, is an announcement that Romania has said they will actually begin shooting down Russian drones. I mean, I think that was implied by the fact they had moved many air assets forward. I haven't seen their rules of engagement, whether, there's kind of a blurring of, if these drones are headed toward the border, then, does that effectively create a de facto air defense umbrella over the Danube ports? I don't know. Next is like a breaking news site. Unfortunately, I couldn't trace this down to a better original source. I just didn't have time before the space. But if anybody has seen sort of what the rules of engagement are there, I would love to see it, and we'll highlight it in a future conversation. Area 51, you had your hand up. Did you want to add something in?
Well, just as of note, and they're no longer on station, but NATO deployed one of their AWACS this evening from Turkey, and they started a orbit where this newly established no-fly zone was. And I just thought it was interesting because I saw several tweets referencing, potential UAV strikes this evening, and I had not noted them flying this late at night, or at least Ukraine time before.
Very interesting. We'll have to keep our eyes on that. Thanks for letting us know. 3 last points. These are sort of general maintaining observational awareness. So the 5th item, tweet from Frederick Van Lokeren. He's been doing great work, sort of like MT Anderson does satellite imagery of the various ports, particularly in the Black Sea. Frederick, Captain Loma, keeps an eye on the Russian naval deployment in the Mediterranean, and he does it once a week, consistently since the beginning of the war. So I want to highlight that good consistency, and you can see here that the Russian presence in the Mediterranean is considerably reduced, I think down to only about 5 or 6 ships. The next item, 6th back, is our friend Colby just caught from the Wall Street Journal that apparently the Russians are trying to reach out to get port access in Libya. But I mean, that begs the question about they only have 5 ships in the Mediterranean at the moment. They're all at Tartus in Syria. It's not clear why they feel they need to expand their basing options. I don't know whether that would be related to concern about potential for developments in Syria and continued access to Tartus, but in any event, keeping your awareness up on that front. Last point before we move on, 7th in the nest, is a tweet put together by Status 6 as a list of Russian naval losses. There are a couple of people with different initiatives going on, but so I like to highlight it when somebody takes the time to consolidate all the events down together. All right. We have a while left. We're ahead of normal schedule, which is great. I'll move on to discussion of developments with Ukrainian forces. Interestingly, there were a few less this week, so we'll get into that. After which we'll discuss some of the rumors about Kadyrov, and then get into a discussion about some developments with Russian forces, which we haven't had an opportunity to turn to in a good week or two. So I'm putting these contents up in the nest right now. They will appear in just a moment. And to start with, the first item is the first item is a letter that was written by several U.S. senators to the White House advocating for the provision of ATACMS to Ukraine, which is a great and positive development. There have been several letters along these lines written by various members of Congress over the last couple of months. But here you see some fairly senior senators contributing their voices. So hopefully, again, there are rumors that the decision is coming closer, but no final word yet. I don't know whether they're trying to sneak in sort of toward the end when the decision is looking likely, or whether they think that this is a critical moment where their voice will tip things over, but I remain optimistic. The second item in the nest I wanted to highlight in connection with ATACMS. And so if you look at John's tweet, John Ridge, he's quote tweeting. And so the OSINT technical tweet suggests that a Russian S-300 was used to, that a Ukrainian air defense system was used to intercept a Russian cruise missile. However, what John is saying is that interpretation doesn't seem to be right, that it wasn't actually an interception of a Russian missile, but that it was an in-flight failure. And John speculates that it might be due to an aged solid propellant motor. So the reason this caught my attention is when we heard about a week ago that the United States said they had a greater inventory of ATACMS than they had been aware of, there was some speculation that might have been because the additional units were out of date, and that the main factor for their stale dating is the age of their solid fuel motors. And so seeing John point out a failure of an S-300, which is a different system, I wanted to say, the risk of these solid fuel motors is a real thing. And in the thread we talked about a week ago from, I think, Bryn Tannehill, where she pointed out if some of the ATACMS that are ultimately sent are coming from these stale-dated units that may have solid fueled motors that are just past a point where the U.S. had said, we don't want to spend the money to inspect them. In order to send them to Ukraine, they'll now have to undertake the inspection because it is a very real risk that they fail. And it's been pointed out that if they were to fail anywhere near the launcher, that would potentially be destructive of the launcher and would be come at a very cost. Nukes, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that ATACMS is a hot launch system, which means the solid rocket fuel motor actually gets fired inside the TEL itself, so inside the launcher. Where S-300 is a cold launch system, so there's a gas generator that fires on a solid rocket motor, and it pushes like a piston out and injects the missile up into the air before the solid rocket motor ignites. So, in theory, this problem is actually it's a bigger problem to have that happen with something like a HIMARS or a M270 versus S-300, just because the missile wouldn't necessarily be in the tube when the detonation happened with an S-300 versus HIMARS or M270 with the ATACMS.
Yeah, that's a great point. Colby, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very important point by Nukes. If the propellant blows up in the launcher, then you're going to lose that HIMARS or M270 and potentially the crew with it. So that is a concern. I'll just say that the challenge is not inspecting the missiles to determine whether the motors need to be replaced or not. That's an easier process. The challenge will be if they do need to be replaced, then that will take a relatively significant period of time in order to replace them, refresh the propellant, and do some other works potentially that would be needed to restore them to serviceability. And of course, I'll be explaining all this tomorrow morning when my thread goes live.
That was a great opportunity to segue to a reminder. Colby's big ATACMS thread is coming out tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't miss it. Continuing on the idea of ATACMS, the third item in the nest, some people had been starting to speculate that since Zelensky will be attending the United States for the UN General Assembly meetings, and then speaking, apparently he's going to do a presentation to an all senators meeting, and then potentially go on to the White House. There had been speculation that maybe there would be a big announcement when Zelensky is present. The third item in the nest. Rob Lee noted in this Axios article that apparently some inside sources are saying, well, no, there is not a plan at this time to announce the delivery of ATACMS during Zelensky's visit. So I just thought I'd put it out there. That's the claim, meaning while we may be getting closer to the decision, it sounds like it's not immediately imminent, because otherwise that would obviously be convenient timing for PR purposes. The fourth item in the nest is just an update that we are expecting another presidential drawdown to be announced next week, which is good news. Again, we're at the 17th of September, so we have essentially 2 weeks left in the remaining authorized amounts, which I think is just over $5 billion. And I know that John and Colby keep beating the drum about last year the Congress undertook to renew that explicitly. They haven't set up any steps for an explicit renewal of that $5 billion. And so people seem to be assuming it will be renewed, but that would be procedurally inconsistent with the way they did it last time. So it's just not clear, and it seems like it will not automatically renew. But hopefully in the next 2 weeks, they have some drawdowns, potentially big ones, in which case a big chunk of that will be forwarded to Ukraine and reduce the issue. The fifth item back is just an update, again via Colby, who is passing along an article from the Wall Street Journal in which they note that the ground-launched small diameter bomb, which will be a significant improvement in terms of lower cost long-range options, apparently is still months away from being transferred. Which is unfortunate. what was the last projection, Colby? Had they said it was hoped it would arrive this fall, or what was the timeline? Like, is this actually a significant delay in the timeline, or was it still projected to be months out and this is just a confirmation?
Yeah, good question. So officially, the administration was only ever really saying it'll come in the fall. They weren't getting much more specific than that, but there was a little bit of reporting and some chatter that, we were thinking that it was going to be September or October, but now, we have this reporting that it's still months away. And, I'll say that, there's obviously, non-open source information. So I'm not going to, base my comments solely on that. You have the public reporting here, but I can say that there is some non-open source information to suggest that, that's probably right. And we're looking at, more November, December potentially, so people can take that however they want.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry, I was just putting some next set of material.
And well, we have a little bit of downtime. I'll just take a quick minute to remind you that if you're looking for resources that are up in the nest, you can find them down in the right-hand corner of your screen. If you're wanting to come up and join us and add to the conversation, you can hit the request mic button that is on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you are looking for replays of the space, or any other content that we've produced, you can find almost all of it on the YouTube channel. If you go to the very right-hand side of the nest, you will find the third tweet back is a tweet that gives you the link to the YouTube channel, and we'll also share it again at the very end of the space. And you can find it down in the replies as well, actually.
Hey guys, sorry about that. I am back. Hopefully I'm good for the remainder of the space. The last item in that block I was going to speak to was, again, an article Colby had highlighted that spoke to the fact that, unfortunately, I guess it was buried in some budget documents, that the I'm not sure how it's typically pronounced, but the 1117 armored vehicle,
1117 I think is typically, yeah.
Yeah, that unfortunately, while these have been purchased with Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funds, apparently the projection for their delivery, because they're being refurbished, is 18 months. So Colby, did you have any more details on those?
Yeah, so this was flagged to me by a former staffer, I guess, at Paper Missiles here on Twitter. And he showed some screenshots from the Senate Appropriations Committee Defense Subcommittee. And this is some sort of commentary from their draft defense budget appropriation for next year. And in there, it references the fact that the armored security vehicles, which are the vehicles that I'm noting, the M1117 or Guardian, as it's also known, that those are not ready and will not be ready for an additional 18 months. And I'll just clarify, because I should have double checked this at the time, but I didn't. That document was from July, so it would be 18 months from then, not now. Just a minor difference of 2 months, but just to be clear, because this blew up a little bit, and now actually Mil in UA, which is a Ukrainian sort of military publication of sorts, has also picked up this story, citing myself. So I just wanted to put that out there for additional clarity. So this is something that I myself and some others have been talking about for a while now, because these were promised back in last November, and it's very peculiar that we still haven't seen them, because it shouldn't be taking this long to refurbish them into a usable state so that they can be donated to Ukraine. And there's been some non-open source information commentary from other people here on the Twitter suggesting that, they're really not actually in that bad shape, and, which adds further confusion as to why this is taking so long. I can't verify that. Obviously, I don't know what actual state this equipment is in and why it's, taking so long. So hopefully the committee, which has requested Assistant Secretary Doug Bush to come before them before December of this year and provide a briefing on this topic. So, hopefully we won't have to wait until the very end of the year to get some further answers on why this is taking so long, because this is a vehicle that I am very confident would be very useful for the Ukrainians. They're always crying out for more armored transport. And this is, a vehicle that's you can see the hull shape. It's a good thing to have when they're dealing with a lot of minefields. So it's very frustrating that this commitment has not yet been delivered. Thanks.
And so two procedural thoughts that flow from that are, it's another good example of, if you're doing reporting or inquiry on these fronts consistently, you'll develop a reputation so that people will just, they'll enter into discussion with you, like having a former staffer who's already following it closely, passing these details on to Colby is a great example of making those connections. The other point I wanted to make is this gray area between what's open source information and what's closed source information, to the extent that if you're taking private information and making it public, it becomes open source, except if you can evidence it, then it's open source. But if it's somebody saying, well, I have reason to know, then it's sort of like gray, right? As in it's coming from a closed source, but because it's not accompanied by evidence, it's sort of the capacity to independently verify the detail that transfers it from being closed to open. And so it's an area that it seems like a lot of friends of ours are increasingly playing in. I see Gurney has his hand up, but from my perspective, he may be in the process of reconnecting. Okay, so once Gurney comes back, he's welcome. We will get his question. Okay. Until then, continuing on, because there weren't a lot of developments on Ukrainian equipment in the last few days, this last block is more about optimistic innovation, or hints that should give us optimism about the innovation potential of the Ukrainians. Actually, so I'm sorry, Gurney has joined us again. So as soon as he can hear us, we'll have Gurney go ahead.
Okay. Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. Just a question, Colby. Do you know when in the PDAs, when the MATVs were announced for Ukraine?
The MATVs?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by it. I started seeing some pictures and videos of MATV, sort of in that it's in the family of JLTV, except it's a step up in size. I asked that question because the M1117s are sort of this unicorn, right? They're if anyone spent time in the service, they're these always promised vehicles, and yet they never seem to show up. Now, that's not an excuse for them not showing up under the USAI funds and whatever refurbishment is happening. But to the question I'm getting to here, I thought those were announced back in the fall of last year sometime, the M1117s. What I don't remember hearing at the time, I do remember hearing some excess MRAPs, and those are an even bigger vehicle going to Ukraine from excess articles or Afghanistan. But the MATV is a much newer product, and I started to see pictures and videos of it showing up. So my question I'm sort of asking her to put context here between this is, I'm wondering if between the M1117s, which is a much older vehicle, both in terms of survivability and whatever's required, whether they're in good shape or not, I don't know what the frames or engines have on them in mileage. The MATV is something that is, a post 2015 product, ground up, developed after the JLTV competition. So I just say this, I'm seeing them on the ground, and we've seen some columns of them delivered, and just from a contextual analysis, they have much more survivability. They're still limited visibility, but much better visibility than the M1117. So I'm saying this is it's kind of surprising to me to see the much newer MATV show up, and if that is a stopgap or that's a plug-in for the M1117s not being there, I'm glad to see that. I don't know if that's the case, but I'm glad to see that because the MATV, much newer vehicle, much more survivable, a little bit better visibility than the M1117. But I don't know if that helps add some context to it. But my question's wrapped in that.
Sure. Okay. I got you. So they have, I'm pretty sure this is exclusively drawdowns. There's been over 500 MRAPs of different kinds that have been sent. So included that in that is the MATVs. They haven't specified exactly, which variants of MRAPs, but that would be one of the MRAP variants that has been provided. And, we can see all the guys that are doing the equipment tracking, in the field, UA Weapons Tracker and others have noted the different American MRAPs that have been sent over. So I don't know how many MATVs were sent, but up to 500 MRAPs of different kinds have been sent. And I'm pretty sure the first deliveries of those happened before the commitment for the M1117s, but I would have to go back and check. But I'm pretty sure the first drawdown probably happened sometime over the summer, and these were pledged in November in the USAI package to fund the refurbishment because they were taking ones that were not in good shape, and then they were going to be donated not by drawdown, but rather the Excess Defense Articles program.
Hopefully that's a question asked and answered. So thanks for that back and forth, guys. Skate Park, you had come up. Did you have a question or a comment?
No, Colby just covered it, so it's okay.
Oh, okay. He does that, doesn't he? Right. Okay. So moving on to these stories about reasons to be optimistic about Ukrainian innovation. The first item in the nest is a report from Euromaidan Press, which highlights that there are projections now out for the 2024 Ukrainian budget, and apparently the amount that of GDP that they plan to spend on defense production is 7 times more than they spent in 2023. And you can see in the second paragraph, they talk about how 21% of GDP will be spent on defense matters. But defense matters and defense production are slightly different things. So it sounds to me, because, obviously they can't spend 7 times more total money on defense. So I think what this speaks to is defense, like production capacity, and suggests that Ukraine is really investing in its own domestic manufacturing. Given the successes we've seen in terms of setting up production lines for mortar munitions, mortar tubes, 152 millimeter, I think 122 millimeter ammo, there has been great progress. And if that amount of budget is now being multiplied by 7 times for investment in 2024, I think that there are good things ahead in terms of Ukrainian domestic manufacturing. Exit, go ahead.
Sorry, I see that Martin came up at the same time as Skate Park, and unfortunately he's not able to raise his hand, so I said I would for him.
Yeah, hi there. I'd just like to, sorry, am I coming through?
Yep, go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I'd just like to add on quickly to the M1117 discussion because I didn't catch a specific mention of that, which was someone actually pointed out to me very recently that currently Greece, a while ago, I believe this was, I'll just bring up the information. Yeah, so it was back in 2021, Greece requisitioned from the U.S. 1,200 of these M1117 vehicles, and they were essentially scheduled to be delivered all the way through 2022 and 2023. And so that is probably the most likely explanation for why they have been taking so long to get to Ukraine, is because Greece is currently further along in the line to get all of these excess defense articles. So just as a note there, that is the most likely explanation why they're not in Ukraine yet. They haven't been seen.
Which is interesting because given that Colby has mentioned that Milin UA, the Ukrainian media site, has picked the story up, if that is the case, I suspect there might be an opportunity for some political pressure to be applied to say, hey, Greece, you're not providing a whole lot of vehicles directly to Ukraine. Perhaps the least you could do is accept a delay in the delivery of your vehicles in order to prioritize refurbishment of vehicles intended for Ukraine. So I wonder if anybody here might be speaking with media, they could pass that on, and that might, highlight the issue and maybe actually move some things.
Yeah, as a note, I did post an article there. Oryx has a good article on the procurement of these M1117s, so that's some good reading in addition.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks very much for bringing it up, Martin. Gurney, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it'd be good to start trying to see if we can get a hold on some of the open source out there for the MATV allocation. And I just say this, it might give an understanding or fill in the picture or not fill in the picture here. But I get that the M1117s are not there, via a prior promise. And for whatever reason that's not good. But if we can understand it or explain it, the optimistic thing to me was seeing MATVs in Ukraine, and when I saw it, I was like, I must have missed the announcements. Now, again, this is anecdotal, right? There could have been announcements out there, or it could have been announced as an MRAP, and then months later show up as an MATV. But the reason I say this is it's actually, in my personal opinion, quite a big difference. An MRAP is survivable, but if anyone's seen them, they're pretty big, they're bulky. If anyone's heard Constantine, we've had vehicle debates over the months here. He's a fan of Humvees. He's not a fan of the MRAPs for height and maneuverability and sightlines. The MATV is something altogether different and newer. Very survivable, almost to the extent of an MRAP, minus the ground clearance. It's a new vehicle. It's got computerized air suspension, decent visibility for a significantly armored vehicle, and it's about 30 to 45 years newer than the M1117. Now, again, whatever reason the M1117s are not there, I'm sure we can look into, but I appreciated seeing these much, much newer MATVs, and to some degree, even more significant than, say, an MRAP because of its actual maneuverability and its lower profile than an MRAP, but completely more survivable in my book than an M1117. So again, I don't know if that fills in a picture here, but it was interesting to see those show up. I did not expect the MATVs to show up.
Well, hopefully that inspires some people to go away and do some digging. If anybody does uncover any material, that details the numbers or the timeline of the delivery of the MATVs, let us know. Feel free to DM it to me, tag Gurney, and if we get more details, then we'll discuss it in a future space. Yeah, go ahead, Gurney.
And just the last point here. Again, I think there's definitely two questions there. The other thing I was going to say is M1117. Look, it's Ukraine needs all the vehicles they can get, armored, survivable. We know that they're getting pickup trucks, so an M1117 has tons of utility and tons of purpose, even if it's older. I was just trying to put into context, an apple versus an orange here. I don't know if total supply of MATV is adequate, but if I could pick between one or the other, did service during the Kosovo and Serbia conflicts, predominant back in the late 80s, 90s, and sort of didn't go out of style, but was doing convoy security and MP duty. And I say this mythical. I never really saw them, even though they were always promised during multiple, regardless of the excursion, they were always promised and a rare unicorn to see. If you saw it, then you saw it.
Well, I'm optimistic then that in 16 months from now, when we see them on the field, we can have all kinds of M1117 unicorn memes, and you know what I mean? I'm sure that some spaces will figure out ways to meme in order to build up NAFO's motivation. Okay. Last couple of points before we move on to discuss Russian forces and the rumors about Kadyrov. The third item in the nest, again, we're talking about sort of innovation on the Ukrainian manufacturing side. Third item, there were several stories that covered the fact that the United States has apparently delivered a quite large 3D printer to Ukraine, which is great news. Perhaps other sources mentioned this as well. This is the one that caught my attention. This article from Defense Scoop, which is saying that apparently that 3D printer is being used right now to print M777 firing pins. And I kind of wonder, it's interesting to me that those firing pins would be the highest priority item. Part of the benefit of a 3D printer is that it can be switched, between tasks quite quickly, obviously, which is great. I don't want to overstate the case. It may be used for many other things, but interesting to me that perhaps it's that there may be a supply of firing pins, but it may not be in the right place at the right time. It would be interesting to learn more about why certain things are being selected to be sort of manufactured just in time, as opposed to others. And if we get insight into that, we'll discuss it. The fourth item is an article from the Kiev Independent, which, again, we're talking about innovation. So in this case, it's a write-up about some approaches from independent creators who are making various pieces of equipment. You can see in the picture, they have the unmanned ground vehicles and the bureaucratic processes that they have to go through. And so we tend to hear lots of stories about the drone development programs from the Ministry of Digital Transformation, about they're very innovative, which is terrific. This is a slightly different spin on it, suggesting that there, in other areas, there was still plenty of bureaucracy that has to be dealt with. I don't know that it's, uncalled for, but it's interesting seeing the sort of the flip side where there are now calls, for potential things that can be done to streamline initiatives further. The last item in this block, the fifth one back there, is an announcement from Zelensky yesterday that apparently Ukraine will be holding their first defense industries forum. Now, I know they've had videos come out, videos and photos come out from the last week or so of various Ukrainian officials meeting with senior leaders from allied defense companies. And there appear to have been several separate meetings with these senior leaders, which is great. I don't know if the idea is they're developing deals directly, which is good, or they're setting the foundation to bring people together. But in any event, apparently they plan to have this big forum come together, where Zelensky is saying that there will be 86 leading companies from 21 different countries, which sounds a little bit like, how they hold the Ramstein military aid conferences for their states that support them. This sounds a little bit like a private Ramstein. And I wonder, what kind of good benefits can come from coordination as between those companies through that forum. It sounds interesting. And again, if anybody sees details on those, feel free to send them to my attention, because I'd love to keep up on that issue. I'm just going to take a moment to put up the next block of material, so just bear with me. I have to scroll all the way down, because we're now into part 2 of the agenda, which you guys might say, oh, okay, great. We almost never reach it, so I am very excited that we're getting into some new types of material we don't often cover. This first set is about the rumors around Kadyrov. It's not groundbreaking, but it's just to make sure we cover it off, because it was a significant area of discussion in the last 2 days. All right.
Mr. Bond, I see that Skate Park's hand is up.
Yeah, go ahead, Skate Park.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to note that both the U.S. Marines have for a while had a 3D printing project. So for forward manufacture of the spare parts, because their idea is that if there's a conflict with a peer adversary like China, they need to have dispersed logistics and to reduce the logistics footprint. One of those things that are going to do is to manufacture spare parts close to where it's going to be used, and also the new concept for the British Army. This came out just recently, and they also have forward manufacture of parts as one of the points in their new concept.
It's certainly a strategy that lots of people are pursuing, as you say, and I do wonder whether there are benefits to this, whether there are any U.S. observers of the way the Ukrainians are applying it. Sort of in the same way that people will talk about new weapon systems getting trial runs. This is sort of like a new logistics system, and so there may be demands on the ground that uncover ways to improve the whole, not only the 3D printing process itself, but like the integration of 3D printing into combat ops that could teach some valuable lessons, I suspect, to allied countries. Okay, so the material about Kadyrov is in the nest. We'll move through it pretty quickly. If it inspires any conversation, then great. So the first item is just the blunt statement that people should not engage in spreading Kadyrov rumors. And so everything I saw yesterday was on the level of rumor. I understand that sometimes you want to break an article, but I saw a dozen or more accounts saying, is Kadyrov dead? Unconfirmed reports that Kadyrov is dead. Once you've seen unconfirmed report from one source, it doesn't add anything to hear it from another dozen. So I understand the incentive, but people will look at the volume of rumor and say, oh, well, if many people are repeating the rumor, then maybe there's more to it, which obviously is a fallacy, but that's the way people operate. So I had a look on Telegram yesterday of the dozen accounts that were saying there are unconfirmed rumors, 2 of them had links to Telegram chats. I followed those links because that's what I do. And in both cases, the Telegram sources just said people are saying Kadyrov is dead, which is, just because you have unconfirmed reports that link to another platform's version of unconfirmed reports, it doesn't, none of it is confirmation. So I didn't find anybody who had actual details. Now, I'll admit, I could be complaining about this, and then it will come out an hour from now that Kadyrov really is dead and he's been dead the whole time, and then I'll look like an idiot, but I'm still standing on the principle, right? This morning, though, second tweet in the nest, a video was released that purports to be Kadyrov walking in a park, and obviously it appears to be Kadyrov and he's in a park, but it purports to be recent, saying that, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. Now, some people have looked at this and said, oh, this might actually be archive footage. It may be older. But I haven't seen any definitive proof that it is not current video. So I'm assuming it is recent until I can find, because it's very hard to disprove that it's not recent. Do you know what I mean? Unless you actually get links to show that it was released earlier. Interestingly, sorry, I doubled up there. So the fourth item back in the nest is from Harold Chambers. For those of you who don't know, Harold follows developments in the Caucasus, including Chechnya, quite closely. And I thought this one was funny. It might be a little bit inside baseball, but he's saying he is referring to these separate groups, right? The one AEDT, and then the NIYSO, right? These are different analytical groups that study developments in this area. And he's saying, well, here's the roundup. And one group says the video proves that he's not dead. Another group says, no, it's archival video, but it's fine, he's not dead. And then this third analyst, Bakar Yengulbayev, says, no, he's dead. Which is to say, people who look at this closely are taking the full spread of possible opinions. So again, based on experts, we just don't have insight into what is correct. So the state of affairs is unconfirmed rumors, a video that appears to be recent. Some are saying it may not be, but I haven't seen proof, disproof of the video, and experts have mixed opinions. The fifth item in the nest, the tweet from Georgi Revishvili, is the only attempt that I've seen to actually do some OSINT on this work, which is apparently one account was sitting outside the hospital where Kadyrov was purported to be, and trying to take photos of the cars that were entering and suggesting there was a higher than expected volume of really expensive cars with Chechen plates or with Chechen speakers in them who were being rushed in, not being checked. But again, whether that, that's not definitive, but I just wanted to at least give props to the fact that somebody out there was trying to prove it, more directly. Colby, go ahead.
I would just note that if you look at Harold's tweet there's 3 tweets in that chain, and then the second one he notes that the Telegram channel, which you can see its watermark is plastered over all those pictures of the cars. In the tweet from Georgie, he notes that channel is not the most reliable sometimes, and I've seen other people say that as well about that particular channel, that sometimes it shares information that turns out to be not correct. So take that however you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. In that we've discussed this a few times, in that a lot of Western intelligence agencies, in doing their evaluations, will give reliability scores not only to the specific item of information in question, but also to the source. And so Colby's point about it's hard to tell whether this piece of info is right, but you do need to look at the overall track record of the source, because if they're consistently bad, then you're more likely to discount. So that's a fair point. Just before I go to Stolis, I'll point out the last item so I can change material over. It's the 6th tweet in the nest. It's a tweet from Konstantin Sonin, who is a professor at the University of Chicago. And there may have been others, but Konstantin is the one I've seen discussing what I think is most relevant, which is everybody had been focused on, is Kadyrov alive or dead? I'm curious about what are the people around him doing? Because if, for example, he was quite ill but not yet dead, or the transition were ongoing, whether he's alive or dead is only the first question. What matters is, what are people doing? Will there be a significant contest? Are actors from the Kremlin coming in? And Sonin isn't undertaking OSINT work to discern those things, but he is saying, because he's a professor of political economy, saying, look, the power in Chechnya may flow through Kadyrov, but the primary value is coming from the Kremlin, where a highly disproportionate amount of tax flow is coming from the Kremlin to Chechnya. As a result, they have a ton of pull in Chechnya, and Sonin's analysis is that it's unlikely that there will be a massive fight, because some faction will fairly quickly fall in behind the Kremlin's, they'll get the blessing from the Kremlin, and that degree of power will likely be enough to consolidate things quickly. So I thought that was interesting. People, there may be experts with different opinions, but it was this level of debate that I was looking for and wasn't finding very broadly. We'll go to Stolis, and then we'll go to Jane. Go ahead, Stolis.
So one thing I'll note, because this is something that I've studied quite a bit, there's very specific rules regarding death around someone who dies in the Islamic faith, regardless of what anyone's thoughts about how orthodox he is on that front. Look for signs surrounding that more than rumor is what would be my suggestion. I would assume that regardless of what the feelings are about that, there would still be method and manners put in place to somewhat respect that, regardless of, how much Russian Duma and their culture in general typically don't like the Muslim faith. That would be my suggestion, and that's the only note that I would add. If somebody in the audience can speak more to that, I would be interested to hear it.
Sure. Well, I mean, based on your last comment there, perhaps you're not able to speak to it. My question was going to be, of the steps, funeral rites or those sorts of things like family obligation, do you have any thought on what of those steps might be the most public that we could observe? Or is that, you saying, hey, it's a great idea, but we should get opinion from somebody who knows better?
So I know a little bit about it. I haven't studied the Islamic side. I've studied a lot more in the Zoroastrian and those areas. But there will be high religious leaders around him just because of his status. There will be high up people from the actual formation of whatever group he's practicing under. Those will be people specifically from Chechnya, would be my assumption. Again, not an expert on this, something I've looked into, and that would be kind of one of the signs that I would expect to see surrounding something like
that. Okay, fair point. Perhaps we'll inspire somebody to write up a little thread on, because I don't recall how long ago it was that Kadyrov's father died, which I think was kind of unexpected. I think it happened when Kadyrov himself was not that old. It would be interesting if there were any records of what happened at that time, for comparison purposes. Maybe somebody will go away and dig it up.
I can take a look.
Sure. I mean, I'm not putting it entirely on you. Sometimes this is just a broad call to the audience because that's what we're trying to do here. You know what I mean? Get lots of contributors. We'll go to Jane and then Nukes. Go ahead, Jane.
Actually, he pretty much brought up what I was going to, and I think that your suggestion of looking at what happened when his dad died might be informational, might not. It depends on how Putin plays this. And he's in a very different situation than he was when his dad died. Just that.
Absolutely. The situation is very different. I totally appreciate that. I will note, for example, that every so often Kadyrov's, I believe he has 3 sons, or at least 3 that are publicly prominent. They occasionally are jet setting. Sometimes they're off for MMA training or other activities around the world. So paying attention to things like, are his sons suddenly being called home? Those sorts of things might be what I would look for. I don't know that I have the means to do that myself, but there might be some among us who would have insight into which planes do Kadyrov's sons typically fly on, and then track those. Nukes, go ahead. Looks like Nukes is just reconnecting, so we'll bring him back up in a moment once he's connected again. Okay. We're just slightly, he'll be up in just a moment. We're just slightly past the 3-hour normal time. We hardly ever get to discuss Russian equipment. Some of this has been sitting around like a week and a half, 2 weeks. I'm interested to speak to some of it. If you guys are happy to bear with me for another, 15 or 20 minutes, I think I can get through it. I'll probably just discuss it in blocks to move more quickly, but that's my plan, hopefully, and then we'll wrap up around 7:30 Eastern in about 20 minutes. Nukes, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah. My question is, who's next in line? I don't really follow Chechnya all that much, so who are the potential successors?
I probably can't answer this question all that intelligently without embarrassing myself, but my assumption is it would be one of his sons. I think his eldest is like 17, if I want to say, maybe 18. which I don't recall what age Kadyrov himself was when he took over, but I don't think he was very much older than 20. So I suspect that would be the intention, certainly from Kadyrov's perspective. Now, whether there would be, in sort of the old medieval sense of an uncle or somebody waiting in the wings, or some desire for the Kremlin to rock the boat to try to shift power, I'm not aware of any of that. But if anybody is aware of folks like Sonnen who, are political economists, or like Harold Chambers, who would have greater insight, then feel free to pass those on. But I'm assuming it would probably be one of his sons. Gurney, go ahead.
Yeah, so on this topic, but maybe just sort of a challenge out there. In that video that was, purportedly, allegedly recent of Kadyrov, I just say this is sidestepping all the recent, the rumor mill, et cetera, et cetera. I sort of challenge any folks out there to sort of geolocate that photo, that video. It should be pretty easy to do. There's what looks like a private walking track with a road next to it, and it's ringed by, privacy pine trees. So if anyone's seen the video, they'll know what I'm talking about when he's walking in the rain. For whatever it's worth, it may or may not put this to bed, but that should be pretty locatable, and tell you whether or not the location is where it's alleged to be in Moscow, or if the location is somewhere else. But you can't, what that looks like is a tree privacy type fence with a walking perimeter or security perimeter and an inner drive. If I just had to guess, and I stay away from guesses, that looks like an expensive private compound, perhaps his own. But again, we have no date on that. So anyways, just thought I'd put it out there.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And just as a word to the wise, learn from hard experience, because subjects that are of high interest, before you spend a long time geolocating something, do a quick search here on Twitter using whatever the relevant keyword is, and then something like the tag @geoconfirmed, because they've probably beaten us to it, just to be honest, which is terrific, because that means if it's a component in your analysis, you're suddenly way further ahead. But also if it's like a one-off, then you won't duplicate the time. You could always do it for fun, you know what I mean, on your own. But I would suggest searching Kadyrov and then @geoconfirmed, and just to be safe, do Kadyrov and then sort it by latest, because it's so recent, and just look through the last couple of hours. Might save you some heartache. And actually, because it's the worst is when you actually find it after putting in time, and then you go to publish it and then realize that somebody got there 2 hours before you, and usually Defmon or OSINT Technical or somebody, and then and that everybody already knows. But Gurney, it's a great suggestion. Okay, I'm going to move quickly through updates on Russian forces. These are I'm trying not to get too down into the weeds, but these are more like reference points or touch points to evaluate progress. So the first you'll see is a tweet where it says production ramp up. This is Rob Lee passing along the article from the New York Times. This was from 4 or 5 days ago, where the Times was talking about artillery production and tank production. In this case, Lee was highlighting the quote with saying that Russia can now make 100 tanks, or excuse me, before the war, Russia could make 100 tanks a year, but now they are producing 200 per year. And so if you think about the point Andrew made when we were talking about it earlier, saying maybe 40 or 50 a month, you multiply that out, right? That's 400 to 600 a year. If the idea is Russia can newly manufacture 200 or so a year, then, maybe 40%, a little less than half of tanks might be new manufacture, and, maybe 60% is refurbishment of old models, as we were discussing earlier. But anyway, that's some insight into the ramp up, not only of artillery production, but tank production. This next item down, again from Rob Lee, passing along, in this case, an article from Reuters. noting the expectation that Russia will, in the next few years, be able to ramp up their artillery shell production to 2 million shells per year, which is double recent Western expectations. But it's still believed that that will be less than the consumption rate. So this is a fairly consistent theme that Russia is ramping up. It's a significant ramp up, but the level they're expected to reach, even in the multi-year level, is still below their consumption rate. So over that time, they will continue to draw down their total inventory. The third item speaks to that. So this is a tweet from a partisan Oleg, who has done some great OSINT work accounting tanks and losses early in the war. You may recall I've cited him several times. So he's essentially done some straight line projections. So it's built into the assumption that it's all straight line. And he's suggesting that even if Russia does double up their production rate to 200 per year new, his belief is Russian firepower, by which I think he is counting tank hulls, will still, from its peak in June of 2022, be reduced to only 1/5 or 1/6 of its peak number by 2024. And so he's suggesting that by 2024, Russian firepower, including shells and tanks, will actually be quite comparable to Ukrainian production numbers. Which again, it's a ramp up, but essentially you're looking at the upper limits of that ramp up, and the numbers coming back are suggesting, oh wow, this could continue to be at parity. And then given all that block I just talked about in terms of Ukraine dedicating its own ramp up to its own domestic production, I would suggest there is potential for Ukraine to obtain significant production upper hand in some critical areas. Andrew, go ahead.
I've seen a projection that if Russia keeps their losses at their current rate, which I personally don't think they will, I think the rate will go down over time. But if they keep at the current rate, by the end of next year, they'll only have about 500 to 700 tanks left in their military.
Right, which I think is what's inspiring partisan Oleg there to say they'll be down to 1/6 of their total usable tank power, suggesting that they'll be on almost equal footing with Ukraine. So I think we're saying the same thing, possibly coming. Yeah,
500 would be way fewer than Ukraine.
Oh, okay. Well, then, terrific. Thanks for the update. Okay. The last 2 points, again, I'm working from the first item in the nest. The last 2 points are attempts at quantification. So there's one under counting BMPs, and this is an account you'll see in his thread. He actually took satellite imagery of the known storage locations for BMPs. And others have done this for tanks previously. I think it was Covert Cabal on YouTube did a fairly in-depth analysis at one point of tank storage yards. This account, HIMARS, did the same for known BMP storage yards and worked through them and came to the conclusion that, Russia is rapidly running down. I think in the end, he said it appears they may have drawn something like 40% of total in storage. Yeah, that's right. From the known yards. He does note that he believes the number of BMT units he was able to count clearly didn't represent all BMTs. I think he said he found, he counted a total of 4,000 vehicles, whereas some counts put it between 7,000 and 8,000 total. So he's saying, look, my survey may only have covered half or a little more than half of known in storage, but it's possible that those estimates of total numbers are wrong, and therefore my percentage is higher. But he's saying that it looks like 40% of inventory of BMPs has been drawn down. And he also notes that some fair share of the remaining 60% in storage don't look to be in tip-top shape. So in any event, I appreciated the thoughtful analysis highlighting, here's the sampling I found, here's the actual imagery, here is my count. I thought this was a great example of OSINT work that sort of replicates what others have done for other vehicles. The last point in this first item in the nest is an article from the Kyiv Independent. I referred to it earlier in response to Jane's question about could Russia be withholding some assets? And on the tank front, in our discussion, we kind of came to the conclusion that's unlikely for tanks and vehicles. But the Kyiv Independent article has a Ukrainian official suggesting that it's possible Russia may be trying to build up a stockpile of missiles so that in sort of the time basis, if they do launch a significant campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, that it can be more focused in time. And we've had several discussions in the last weeks about Ukraine having been very conscious of this and making efforts to relocate some of their air defense assets to protect infrastructure relevant to the winter, whether that be power systems or the like, and that they're doing a lot to try to beef up the quality and their ability to repair their infrastructure. So it seems like both sides are sort of anticipating this strategy coming up in the next couple of months. Now on to the second tweet in the nest. Some stats here on personnel. So you can see in this first item, which is from the UK Defense Intelligence, they're passing along statements from Russian officials saying that the intention is for Russia to recruit 420,000 personnel by the end of this year, but that they've made statements that so far in the year they've recruited 280,000. So whatever the current Russian deployments are, by their own assertions, their intention is between now and the end of the year to recruit roughly 140,000 more people. So again, this is not a wave of mobilization. This is just their ongoing contract process, plus some press ganging potentially of vulnerable peoples. So you get a sense of what their intention for ongoing personnel development is. Connected with that, the second link there under the phrase Russian stop loss, it's a tweet from Dara Massicott of the RAND, or recently of RAND Corporation. I think she's now at Carnegie. And apparently a rep from the state, the Russian State Duma, Kurtapolov, has come out and he's confirmed that those who have been mobilized will not be released from service until the end of the quote unquote special military operation. And so while they get a vacation, apparently it's an indefinite stop loss for these mobilized, which is going to create wear and tear and will affect the motivation of the soldiers the longer the war drags on. The third item down is one of the most detailed and attempts to quantify Russian losses is the ongoing research done by Mediazona and BBC Russian Service, who are tracking it via death announcements in Russian media. And it's acknowledged that their count is way under count. But because they're so consistent in their methodology, if you count it as a percentage, if you say they're generally able to find 1/4 to 1/3, you can kind of, just multiply it out to get a better sense of the actual number. I won't make an argument about what that multiplication factor is at the moment, but I will say their latest report that I've seen is 31,000 confirmed death reports for the Russians. And the number is almost certainly, 2, 3, 4 times that. I believe one of the last U.S. intelligence estimates was 120,000 dead for the Russians, which would imply a multiplication factor of 4 versus the Mediazona estimates. So I like that as a touch point. The fourth item down in the tweet is an article from the Russian newspaper Meduza, noting that Russia's social insurance fund had until recently actually been releasing data on disability counts, but they have now decided not to publish those anymore. So I guess they're getting concerned about what that data is revealing, and we're losing a little bit of insight into estimates of the injured. Final point in this tweet again from Medusa, is just on the personnel front. There are now reports that the Rosgvardia is actively incorporating people who were formerly in Wagner, and in particular, I guess these are known personnel who were formerly inmates, who are now showing up as members in the Rosgvardia forces. So to the extent you had any questions about what's happening with Wagner personnel, that's where they're going. Third tweet in the nest, you can see from a few days ago, the Belarusian Hagen project tracked an additional shipment of what that they believe was nuclear weapons into storage sites in Belarus. This is a story we've been following for quite a while. And there were there were claims that the weapons had been transferred, but this sounds like it was the second actual transfer. And so there are lots of good details on the transfer mechanism, the route, and so on from that tweet by Belarusian Hagen. Second item down, the Zapad military exercises have been canceled. These are, I think they're held every 4 years, if I'm not mistaken. And they're usually giant exercises. It was expected they would be anticipated, but now we have the formal announcement. Third item down, there was speculation for months that in addition to the drones that Iran is providing to Russia, that there was being contemplated that Iran might provide either short-range or intermediate-range ballistic missiles. And I can't, this one I'm putting up because it's interesting. I can't confirm it. But it is a claim coming out from the director of the Mossad, David Barnea, saying that steps were taken that foiled Iran's intention to transfer these missiles. I don't know what to make of that. I haven't followed it up. Given it's coming from the Mossad, I'm assuming there's some weight to it. I just don't know what foiled implies, whether there was political pressure applied or whether there was some more covert action that changed circumstances that it made it no longer desirable. But it seems, at least to me, it seems a little bit mysterious, but obviously good news if Russia is not receiving those weapons. Fourth item down under test ban treaty commitment is despite Russia pulling out of the START treaties, so they're no longer confirming their nuclear weapons counts to the Americans anymore, which is concerning. We've discussed before. Interestingly, on September the 7th, one of the officials from Russia spoke with the chief of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization that prohibits nuclear testing, and the Russians indicated they had no intention of withdrawing from that protocol. So that's a good update. Last item in this block was just an interesting story about Russian volunteer organization manufacturing drones. Our friend Sam Bendet covers these closely, and he found a story on Telegram where a volunteer outlet was discussing essentially a hostile takeover, where they had been an independent outlet that had been raising funds and assembling the drones themselves, when apparently some armed people showed up and asserted, hey, you're now part of our initiative. You're under our direction. And they were very confused. Apparently, it's not the government asserting it. They suggest in the thread that they did some digging, and it sounds like somebody in Moscow may have been claiming credit for their work for months, even though that person had no affiliation with them. And now it's like a battle as between those entities for who can take credit over the manufacture of numbers of drones, I guess for internal Russian political prestige, which is just a very weird dynamic. But anyway, it sounds interesting to me. Let me see, where was I? Okay, I'm going to do maybe 2 more blocks and then we'll call it. So let me put these up. Sorry, one more, and then I'll get going. The first of these is about the
I think we lost him.
I think so. Yep.
Sorry, I was looking at another tweet that somebody was trying to send to me. My apologies, everybody. I will take a quick opportunity to remind you that up in the nest, it is the third one from the very end, is the link to the YouTube. You can go there to find a replay of this or any other space that we have done. I believe we have Mr. Bond back on video this week, which is really exciting. And yeah, hopefully he'll be back here in just a quick second here.
And I'm back. Sorry about that, guys. I'm always pressing my luck with the emulator here. It gets cranky when it's been running too long. I'll speak to these last 2 or 3 blocks. And again, if anybody has to, go who is assisting me, no worries about that. We'll hopefully be, 5 more minutes. I just like finally getting to some of these items that I've been holding for a week or two, and then that way we'll have a sort of fresh slate for our next space. Sorry, I'm just sorting out where I am in the nest. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense, the way I've put it up. Okay. So the first set of material here is just about the defection of that helicopter pilot, because there was some fallout from it that was quite interesting. And okay, so if you have a look at it, you can see that there was an interview that was done with the helicopter pilot. So that's the first item. It's an interview. The details of the interview were covered in this article from The Drive. So you can see it's in the tweet by Tyler Rogway. But then the second item in that block is the announcement that the helicopter pilot had been awarded $500,000 as part of the Ukrainian bounty program on Russian equipment. And you can see that the accompanying article from Medusa covering that. Following that, Ukraine came out and made another offer. I think it's novel. I don't think it was included in their prior bounty program. And in that, you can see they made an offer if anybody were to surrender together with a MiG that was carrying a Kinzhal missile, they would offer a reward of $2 million and documents that would allow somebody to move and live in any NATO country of their choice for their whole family. It's interesting that they can promise the NATO documentation. Which I wonder if they've worked that out with all the NATO countries in advance, or if they're saying it and then they'll figure it out when the time comes. There have been plenty of reports of the Russians making overtures the Ukrainians making overtures to Russian pilots. Several reports of those plots having been foiled. But I think with the success with this Russian helicopter pilot, they're thinking one good example of it being pulled off may create a lot of temptation in the minds of other pilots. So perhaps this is the time to sort of sweeten the promise. Go ahead, Exit.
Well, it just kind of sounds like maybe that $2 million isn't necessarily like it could be funded from some of the other NATO countries who might also be interested in seeing that particular round.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I will admit I don't know how valuable Western countries would find getting a copy of a Kinzhal, but you're right. Maybe it would be particularly valuable to them as well. Last point in this item is that also following the defection of that helicopter pilot, the Ukrainians reported that apparently calls to their I Want to Live hotline, which gives information on steps that would be necessary to surrender, that calls to that hotline were up 70%. Now, occasionally when I see this reported, the detail, they'll say, it will be almost misrepresented by the media as saying, oh, 25,000 Russians have called to surrender, when there have been 25,000 calls to the hotline, period. Generally, for those who may be curious, but the percentage of those calls that result in an actual surrender, I don't know. I would assume it's, a low percentage, still significant, but, I just want to mention it when you hear coverage of that hotline. The total number of calls is not equal to the total number of surrenders. NatSec Media, please go ahead.
Double Venture from Kiev. Maxim Kuzimov was interviewed here by a lot of journalists I know at the media center. It was kind of paraded as a big deal locally, just in case. I don't know how you guys see it from the outside, but just so from the local perspective. Presented as this intel victory. In fact, it came right around Military Intelligence Day, if you guys are not marking those. But just a reminder that I think that was a 6-month operation before it was announced. So that might give some sense of what went into it from the GUR.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Always happy to have the on-the-ground perspective of things. And it has been really cool following the Ukrainian various days, whether it's the Intel Professionals Day, or there was one just the other day for I think electronic warfare professionals. So I think it's really cool that Ukraine is dedicating individual days to those different military specialties. Exit, go ahead.
Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so there is one thing I did want to just go back a few points to the, let me just bring that up, the claim by the director of Mossad regarding Iran providing long-range missiles and so on to Russia. I just wanted to highlight that this is, of course, completely unconfirmed information. Really, we have nothing to go off of, but there has been a consistent theory regarding the ATACMS ballistic missile system that potentially one of the reasons why it's taken so long to be sent, or that hasn't been sent yet, is that there was some sort of arrangement, some sort of essentially deal that Iran would agree not to send, would not send ballistic missiles to Russia so long as ATACMS was not provided, or something along those lines. So there has been a theory that I've seen sort of go around in circles from time to time, though. So that is part of the significance of that bit of news, is that potentially could be behind the recent news potentially pertaining to ATACMS.
I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that. As you point out, unconfirmed. I guess what might flow from that, though, is if, as is expected, there is an announcement about the U.S. providing ATACMS in the next weeks, then we'll have to see what happens on the Iranian. If the Iranians take any steps shortly after that, there might be, it might suggest there was more merit to that theory. But if anybody has any more insight into where that theory originated, or literal sourcing, feel free to pass it along to us. Would love to see it.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find something relevant to put there.
Perfect. Thanks very much. NatSec Media, go ahead.
By the way, today is National Rescuers Day, since you mentioned that you like to know the days. Earlier, I posted some photos from some bad events when I can say that the rescuers out there, and I hope there's enough attention to make sure they have the resources, but it's National Rescuer Days. Not to keep us off track, but just to put resources on your table. I frequently ask different types of investigations at the Media Center, different organizations that come forward for things like occupied territory coverage, or disinformation coverage. When they bring up OSINT specifically, what are your methods? How are you approaching it? What are you gaining? And for those of you keeping track of that type of stuff, if you're not getting enough on the outside, you might find that, for instance, they're using OSINT skills here to identify collaborators through social media with enough sensibilities that we might have missed, for instance. And the organizations are often at the media center available to with their kind of best people to offer questions and answers. So if there's something like that you need to know, let me know.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. We'll brainstorm some entities that might be helpful to reach out to. And more broadly, we have been highlighting that several friends of ours who frequent the space are increasingly reaching out to media in order to get questions in. And so, Chris is a valuable resource on that end by being, for many reasons, including by being on the ground in Kiev. So if you ever want an ally who might be able to get a couple of answers for you that otherwise would be hard to get outside of being on the ground, then keep Chris in mind.
I keep a list of the different briefings for even though you can call the media center to get it directly, and I would advise that stay on the producer list. And for instance, I keep it independent. That way I can search it for something I know. People I got used to, like Exit knows this. If I see someone who's just covering something perfectly, like the grain deals, I don't even have to worry about thinking about it. It's automatically going to go there. So each person here that has a specialty, the more I can know that. If I see a source here, I'll be glad to hook them up.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly the sort of collaboration we're looking to build on. Okay, so I know my promises of timelines are almost always wrong, but we are working toward wrapping. Just before I sort of as a final admin note, just a reminder, I have the invitation to our next conversation, which will be Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. It's the first item in the nest, so if you're enjoying our talk, set your reminder now. Okay, the last two blocks, I'm working from the third item back in the nest. This is developments following the visit with Kim Jong-un from North Korea. So apparently Russian media just today has announced that Kim Jong-un has departed, which came as news to me because it sounds like Putin had left Vladivostok 2 days ago. And I guess his schedule was busy, but that Kim Jong-un still had quite an agenda of visits to conduct. I don't know whether it's because he's actually conducting business and, making connections, or he just doesn't get out much. And therefore, it's shooting PR B-roll so that they can air it in Korea for the next several years. It's one, I'm leaning toward the second, but who knows, maybe he was actually doing useful business. To that end, you'll see in the tweet, the next two items under visits include some sites that he visited in his last days there, including the fleet, the Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok. You see there's video of him there. And then he also visited the Komsomolsk on Amur aviation plant. So if you're really into North Korean matters and you're curious where he may have been making connections, there's lots of media up, and these are some examples. Further down, you'll see under the phrase "no agreement," that's the Kiev Independent noting the reports that no agreements were signed. Apparently, this was stated by Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, which is interesting. Normally, you wouldn't expect the Russians to be highlighting their lack of agreements. I don't know if this is them trying to misdirect, and they made arrangements for weapons supply, and then they say, "Oh, nothing to see here." But in any event, that's what the Russians are claiming, that no agreements were signed. You can also see there is the South Korean diplomatic response, again covered by the Kiev Independent, where the South Korean foreign minister came out and said that North Korea reaching any agreement related to arms trade with Russia through this summit would be an extremely serious threat to the security and peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we had previously speculated that if North Korea were to provide arms, that might open the floodgates for South Korea to consider providing arms directly to Ukraine. And so we're not there yet, but it seems like South Korea is keeping a close eye on it. Also, in that tweet, under the phrase SK reports for South Korean reports, we heard claims where Budanov, the Ukrainian intelligence director, spoke with the media suggesting that North Korea has actually been providing munitions for a month and a half. What we have here under this tweet, SK reports, is Ankit Panda, who is prominent in arms control work here on Twitter, passing along a report from South Korean media where the South Korean media is presenting evidence that claims to show North Korean arms already in Russian hands. Now, Panda is passing it along only with a for what it's worth label. So I don't think that's an endorsement by the arms control expert of the South Korean claims, but those claims are being made. So I'm putting that on your radar. And then finally, in connection with the North Korean visit, you'll see under North Korean labor discussion that Julia Davis, who does a great job following media developments in Russia, has noted several conversations they've had on their late night programs, very excited about the burgeoning relationship with North Korea, and suggesting that North Korean labor, because they have very low demands in terms of payment and so on, they have very few expectations, should be used heavily in resource development in the Russian East. And so, that strikes me, all these arguments about Russia not being a colonial power, they're more than happy to use, if not slave labor, which is entirely possible given the control North Korea may exert over laborers. If not slave labor, then certainly sounds to me like it reeks of, a colonialist mentality of let's take these folks who are desperate to do the hard work for us in terms of resource extraction. Okay, moving on to the last block, which is the fifth tweet back in the nest. And this is some update on Russian engagement in Africa, which, it's a broad issue. We haven't been touching on Africa in general, so we'll just keep it narrow for today. You'll see in that first tweet under aircraft losses in Africa that Telegram channels connected with Wagner are claiming that Wagner has actually lost 4 aircraft in Africa in the last week. I know I've seen reports of 2, if not 3 of these 4. So the claim is they've lost 2 Mi-8 helicopters, an Su-25 aircraft, like a combat aircraft, I think it's ground attack, if I'm not mistaken, and an An-25, which is sort of like a lighter cargo plane. And the Wagner affiliated Telegram channel is saying they all crashed due to technical problems. I know from independent reporting, there have been claims that at least the Su-25 may actually have been a shoot down. So don't take their statement completely at face value, but it was a good summary of the fact that a number of Russian aircraft, I think at least 3 or 4, as they're claiming, have gone down. And apparently many of these were in the hands of Wagner operatives assisting their contacts in Africa. Go ahead, Exit.
I was just clarifying, did that include the one today?
I don't know. I'd have to look at the timing in that the screen cap that was shared in this tweet taken from Telegram doesn't include the date. So I'm just not sure when that came from. You could always message the Dead District to ask, or if let me know if it matters to you, and I can try and find the original on Telegram, because it's usually not that hard to find if you just do the text search. So I don't know, but it sounds like they're losing aircraft at an alarming rate.
Yeah, I had seen a report earlier today of another one that went down, but after we're out of the space, I'll go and try and search that up.
Sure. Skate Park, go ahead.
Yeah, there might be some double counting here, because there's been reports of Mali Air Force helicopters being shot down by Al-Qaeda, and also an Su-25 shot down by the Tuareg rebels in the north. So it's a bit unclear if they're just blaming technical errors to cover that they have been shut down.
I do tend to think that they're blaming technical errors as opposed to shoot downs. I think it's an open question I haven't been able to follow up on, whether those aircraft were being operated by Malian military personnel or whether they were being operated by Wagner operatives. I'm not sure. The Wagner tweet seems to suggest it was Wagner operatives. But we'll keep an eye on it. I know some of our friends, Cassis Belli, Fabian, and the like, may already have the answers to these questions. Okay, last couple of points. Running down that tweet, you can see, again, having mentioned Fabian, who was a past guest of ours, he put a tweet out noting that there was a meeting just the other day between the Russian deputy defense minister meeting with Mali's defense minister and the defense minister of the junta or leadership group out of Niger. And interesting, it's interesting to me because there were lots of accounts talking about how Russia was not behind the coup in Niger, not part of a motivating factor, which I believe to be true. But now their new, quote unquote, defense minister is happy to meet with the Russians. So just because they weren't involved in the overthrow doesn't mean they don't have influence in the development of things on the ground now. Flowing from that meeting, you'll see the third item down, Eric Toller, who's now with the New York Times visual investigation team, observed that one of the attendees at the meeting was a Russian intelligence officer called Averyanov, and he's the person who was claimed to be in charge of the Kremlin's takeover of Wagner assets in Africa, and a leading candidate for potentially having been involved in Prigozhin's death. In the past, being known for organizing assassinations abroad, including the poisoning of the Skripals. So people are paying close attention to his movements and how effective he is, apparently in his new role, trying to take over Russian interests in Africa. Speaking of, well-known folks going to Africa, the next item down is that General Surovkin, who recently had been apparently under a cloud, reportedly under house arrest for several months since the Wagner revolt. He was last seen about a week ago out and about, sort of at liberty in Moscow, and people were wondering about his role. Now he's been photographed attending a military meeting in Algeria. And so it looks like he's continuing to be used in, an official capacity by the Kremlin, suggesting they must have some confidence in him, but perhaps he's being deployed in Africa in a way that might be useful, but not a lot of risk, by keeping him well outside the country. Anyway, that's one item to keep an eye on. The sixth item down, I think it says ISW, so Institute for the Study of War, on Surovkin, in their analysis from Friday, they are saying that they believe that Surovkin may actually have been the one who has been appointed in order to take over Russian interests in North Africa. And so it's not clear if he has been deployed for that purpose, what his area of control is relative to Averyanov. So anyway, that's all uncertain. And folks like All Eyes on Wagner and Jack Margolin, I'm sure, will be paying close attention to the developments. Final point here. Under Shoigu's job security, since we're talking about some of these high-ranking members, Surovkin and so on, settling into new positions, there was an interesting article from the Washington Post that discussed the fallout on the senior leadership of the Russian military. It's titled "The Shuffle of Russian Military Chiefs Precedes the Death of Prigozhin." And within this, they say, it's analyst opinion, but they say they think they have Putin has no choice but to keep Shoigu in charge of the military, because if they made a switch now to a more talented defense minister, it would present a threat directly to the president, particularly if a change in leadership resulted in improvement in the Russian outcome in the war. People would start to, associate that success with a new person, which, would be to accumulate political power in a new direction. NetSec Media, please go ahead.
Yeah, so in case you hadn't heard, I launched WagnerProject.org a few months ago. I'm still working quite a bit on trying to get the data in, because I'm only going to go with what's in sanctioned sources versus editorial and/or original writing at this point, just yet. But the Averyanov was in charge of GRU Unit 29155, what we would call a wet jobs department. And I would invite those interested in that topic for a reason to go get the book KGB Poison Factory and look back at the history of these operations. The idea that he's in there is interesting. So there were 8 people on the plane that went down, and one of the areas that I'm going to be trying to make sure is very easy to follow visually, to build on the work other people are doing, and also to highlight the work that they're doing, is to remind us that there were a whole lot of other commanders sitting in those locations that are still in operation. Zakharov and others that were running the shell operations in Libya, Mali, Sudan, etc. They're still there. You just rebrand and keep them in operation. So I'm going to try to make it to where it's real visually interesting to follow, so that the information isn't convoluted and reporters and analysts can get to it quickly, and hopefully boost the work of some of these great people you just mentioned. But he's one of the leaders we're going to be watching, because they're still around. So thank you for covering that.
Yeah, I'm glad that your project and All Eyes on Wagner and so on are keeping close eye on it. Do go and check out Chris's project as another touch point for reference as we figure out how the Kremlin is engaging in Africa. Okay, I think with that, I'll wrap up. I know we went long. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. So thank you to everybody who dropped in to listen. I think it was a great conversation. We had a couple of speakers come up who are terrific, who hadn't joined us before. Thank you to everybody who spoke. I would encourage you guys listening to check out the profiles of our speakers. Essentially, all of them have been following the war in great detail since the beginning, and I'd encourage you to consider following them. Just a reminder, again, about Colby's epic thread about attackums. He's releasing at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, so do check that out. And I guess finally, I'd like to thank my co-hosts. So Area 51 and Exit, thank you very much. Without your guys' help, it would be very hard to run these spaces. And so I hope that I see you guys all for another discussion on Thursday night. And until then, have a good night.